Chapter 114. The little fellow had a very, very long dream. In that dream, there were wonderful magical castles, lively and cute cartoon dolls, and colorful and brilliant magic. It was a very, very long dream. She wanted to ride the roller coaster, but Papa didn't take her. Sister Chang'e was the best. It was Sister Chang'e who took her to ride the roller coaster. There were many people riding the roller coaster. The little fellow had ridden it with Sister Chang'e several times, but she still hadn't gotten tired of it. Where's Papa? The little fellow suddenly thought of Papa, so she sat on the roller coaster and looked around for Papa. Nyen nyen. Daddy is here. The little fellow looked in the direction of the voice and suddenly saw her father flying in the sky and greeting her. Papa. She immediately jumped up excitedly and threw herself into her father's arms. Daddy will take you to the sky to pick the stars, okay? Okay. She sat in her father's arms and looked at the roller coaster below her getting smaller and smaller. It flew higher and higher, but she didn't feel afraid at all. Suddenly, a white cloud floated in front of the little fellow's eyes. She pulled off a piece and held it high in her hand. She looked at her father and asked, Papa, is this a cloud? Yes, try it. Is it delicious? Hearing this, the little fellow immediately took the white cloud and took a bite. The sweet taste immediately made her smile until her eyes narrowed. Delicious. Papa, eat it. Nyen Nyen is so obedient. Delicious. The father and daughter ate the cloud. Suddenly, she woke up from the dream. The light was a little dazzling. The little fellow closed her eyes tightly and moaned for a long time before she finally opened her eyes. Nyen Nyen, you're awake? A woman's voice came into her ears. The little fellow sat up with the help of the woman, with a confused expression on her face. She rubbed her eyes and glanced at the woman. Then, she suddenly burst into tears with a wah. Papa! Papa! Qin Ruing was stunned. Seeing this, she immediately walked over from the side. He gently hugged the little fellow in his arms and kept comforting her. Daddy is here, Daddy is here. Hearing that familiar voice, the little fellow slowly stopped crying. She pouted and hugged Xianxia tightly. It was as if he had been greatly wronged. After comforting her for a while, she saw that she was no longer crying. He picked her up and said with a smile, Let's go. Daddy will take you to wash your face. The little fellow lay on top of Xianxia, staring blankly at Qin Ruing with red eyes. Qin Ruing was also looking at her. However, the expression on Qin Ruing's face was very sad. When she saw Xianxia pick up the little fellow from the bed, she immediately stood up from the chair and walked to the side to make way for Xianxia. When Xianxia saw her sad expression, he immediately reached out and patted her arm. He smiled and comforted her. Give the child some time, okay? Qin Ruing nodded and forcibly swallowed back the tears that had already welled up in her eyes. She took the little fellow to the bathroom. She also wanted to follow and see how she washed the little fellow. But as soon as she took a step, she immediately stepped back. There was the sound of running water in the bathroom. The little fellow bit the toothbrush and said something to Xianxia in a muffled voice. All of a sudden, Xianxia laughed. Qin Ruing really wanted to hear what they were talking about, so after hesitating for a moment, she quietly leaned toward the bathroom. However, she was neither a cultivator nor a necromancer. She was not even a martial artist. So no matter how hard she tried, she could not hear what the little fellow was saying. The sound of running water stopped abruptly. Qin Ruing hurriedly returned to the original place as if she had never moved. After washing up, the little fellow finally woke up. She took her out of the bathroom and went directly to Qin Ruing. Nyen Nyen, Daddy is going to cook. Mommy will play with you, okay? Hearing this, the little fellow could not help but hesitate. She looked up at Xianxia and then at Qin Ruing. After serious consideration, she nodded gently and said very obediently, Okay. Good girl. Go, let Mommy watch cartoons with you. With that, she pinched her little face and then handed her hand to Qin Ruing. Qin Ruing seemed to have not recovered yet. Seeing this, she smiled gently and said, watch cartoons with her for a while. After that, she held the little fellow in one hand and Qin Ruing in the other. After putting the mother and daughter's hands together, he said with a smile, Daddy is going to cook. I'll call you when it's ready." The first sentence was said to the little fellow, but the second sentence was said to Qin Ru. After that, Xianxia winked at Qin Ru. Everything was understood without words. The mother and daughter watched Xianxia walk out of the west wing. After he gently closed the door, Qin Ring, like a puppet with a spring wound, asked the little fellow tentatively, "Nyan, Mommy, can I hold you?" The little fellow nodded, raised her little hand and said sweetly, "Mommy, hold me." Hearing this, Qin Ruing suddenly looked a little excited. She quickly squatted down and gently took the little fellow into her arms. Then she held the little fellow's butt and picked her up. It was different from the excitement of reunion. At this moment, Qin Ruing's heart was only filled with joy. Joy from the bottom of her heart. She was so happy that she couldn't help crying. "Nyan, what cartoon do you want to watch? Mommy will find it for you." It seemed that she didn't want the child to see her crying. So after Qin Ruing put the little fellow on the bed, she immediately turned around to look for the remote control. While looking for the remote control, she secretly wiped the tears off her face. Qin Ruing pretended to look for the remote control. The little fellow waited for a while and seemed to be a little impatient, so she lay on the bed and looked for it herself. Sure enough, the remote control was lying quietly on the bedside table. She picked up the remote control and immediately giggled, "Here it is. Here it is." As she spoke, she skillfully pressed the button to turn on the TV. The channel was a children's channel, and it was playing her favorite cartoon. So she immediately turned to the other corner of the room and shouted, Big cat, come on, let's watch the cartoon." She didn't know where the big cat was hiding just now. But after hearing the little fellow's call, it immediately came out, turned into a black shadow, and drilled into the little fellow's arms, and obediently watched the cartoon with her. Qin Ruing turned around and looked at her daughter, who was holding the remote control and holding the big cat in her arms. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. The little fellow waited for a while. Seeing that she was still in a daze, she immediately shouted to her, "Mommy, sit here." As she spoke, she patted the quilt beside her. Qin Ruing sat on the edge of the bed, but the little fellow seemed to be a little dissatisfied, so she immediately pouted and said, "Mommy wants to sit here." Hearing that, Qin Ruing immediately took off her shoes and sat beside the little fellow. After seeing that she sat down, the little fellow nodded in satisfaction, then directly raised her arm and drilled into her arms like a cat. "Mommy, watch the cartoon with me." "Mommy will watch it with you." Outside the house. After hearing the conversation between the mother and daughter, Xianxia couldn't help but smile slightly. After laughing for a while, he felt relieved and walked to the kitchen. Chapter 115. The courtyard of the Qin family suddenly became lively. There were not many dishes at home, so Xianxia went to the supermarket first, and then went straight to the kitchen with bags of food. In this family, only he and Nyan were outsiders. It was also because of these two outsiders that the atmosphere in the house became a little strange. Qin Ruing and the little fellow were watching cartoons in the west wing, Qin Xueqing was making a phone call in the east wing, and Qin Yongyan was alone in the study next to the main room, doing something unknown. There were more people at home, so the dinner naturally had to be more sumptuous. So when Xianxia returned to the kitchen, he started 3 stoves at the same time. He washed and prepared the vegetables, shredded and peeled them, and cooked the soup and stir-fried the vegetables. He was very busy. After all, he did not have 3 heads and 6 arms, so he simply used the sword controlling technique and the fire controlling technique, preparing to cook this family banquet with the means of immortal cultivators. Yes, family banquet. Xianxia was brought up by his grandfather since he was a child. Unfortunately, his grandfather died early, so he had no relatives in this world for a long time. When he was in college, he finally had a lover. It also made him understand what it meant to care. Now, his lover became his family. Therefore, her family had become his family. He had a family. It was a kind of relationship that was not related by blood but was comparable to blood. A person who had no family suddenly had a family. So he cherished it more than anyone else. Spiced goose platter, stewed bird's nest with rock sugar, small bowl of golden hook fin, steamed lobster, braised eel, dragon tongue, abalone with snail meat, liaoning ginseng with sauce, steamed crab, steamed eastern star spot, caterpillar fungus stewed with flour glue, 10 dishes, all of which were main dishes. Ying liked to drink vegetable soup, so Xianxia specially made a nourishing vegetable soup for her in winter. Xianxia scooped up a spoonful with an iron spoon and tasted it. Well, it tasted good. As for the little fellow, she was not picky. As long as it was made by her father, she liked to eat it, so it was easier to clean up. Because he didn't know what his father-in-law and sister-in-law liked, Xianxia couldn't cook a dish for them for the time being. Because it was winter, before 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky of Xianxia was completely covered by the curtain of night. Tens of thousands of lanterns lit up the sky without night, 10 li of beautiful gauze filled with fragrance. The lights in the Qin family's courtyard were also turned on. There were many dishes today, so they could only eat in the main hall. After placing the bowls and chopsticks in order, Xianxia shouted towards the door, "The food is ready. Come and eat first." The little girl heard her father's shouts. Therefore, she immediately jumped out of Qin Ruing's arms and stood on the bed, jumping up and down as she said smugly, "Mama, it's time to eat. I'm hungry. I want to eat." "Okay, let's go. Mommy will take you to eat." Qin Ruing carried the little fellow out of the west wing. When he arrived at the main hall, he was immediately shocked by the sumptuous dinner in front of him. "You did it?" She put down the little fellow, then pointed at the big meal in front of her, and couldn't help but ask suspiciously. Xianxia used to cook, but he only knew how to cook a few simple home-cooked dishes. He didn't even think about complicated dishes. Take the table in front of her as an example. Even if Xianxia told her that he bought it outside, she would probably believe him immediately. "How is it? Is my cooking okay? You've improved." Qin Ruing quietly glanced at the little fellow. Seeing that she was only focused on the dishes on the table, she quickly kissed Xianxia on the face. Being rewarded by his wife, Xianxia immediately smiled proudly. He didn't put in so much effort in vain. It was okay. Although they hadn't seen each other for a long time, the tacit understanding between them had become even closer. The two of them stood in front of the main hall and waited for a while. Seeing that the little fellow was a little impatient, they made a move almost at the same time. Without any prior discussion, Qin Ruing pointed to the study on the right, and Xianxia pointed to the east wing on the left. Seeing this, Qin Ruing immediately smiled and said, "Telepathy." Xianxia said, "Telepathy." After that, both of them couldn't help laughing. Qin Ruing turned and walked to the study. "I'll call Dad first." After she left, Xianxia touched the little fellow's head and said, "Nyin, good girl. Don't steal food. Dad will call Auntie to eat. We'll eat when Grandpa and Auntie arrive." "But I won't steal food." The little fellow nodded heavily while chewing the spiced goose. "Naughty." Xianxia gently pinched her little face, which was bulging like a hamster, and walked out of the main hall with a smile. The light in the east wing was on. Qin Shueqing had been hiding in the room since she came home. No one knew what she was doing. Xianxia knocked on the door, but she didn't respond. He couldn't just barge into his sister-in-law's room. Therefore, Xianxia waited outside for a while and shouted outside the door, "It's time to eat." He didn't call her that, because he really hadn't thought about how to call his sister-in-law. If he called her by her full name, it would seem too distant. If he called her by her name, with his current relationship with his sister-in-law, he was afraid that he would be slapped in the face. Therefore, Xianxia thought about it and simply didn't even call her by her name. After waiting for a while, the door opened. Qin Shueqing walked out of the east wing and stood in front of Xianxia. She looked at Xianxia thoughtfully, but still didn't say a word. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled and said to her, "It's time to eat." After that, he turned and walked to the main hall. He had already said what he wanted. It was up to her whether she wanted to eat or not. Looking at Xianxia's back, Qin Shueqing hesitated for a moment, then suddenly said, "The leader wants to see you. He hopes that you can come with me to the headquarters in Shangjing." Xianxia didn't turn around, as if he didn't hear her. Qin Shueqing was a little anxious and immediately wanted to chase after him. But at this moment, Xianxia suddenly stopped in his tracks. He leaned to the side and glanced back at Qin Wanqing. Then, he said coolly, I can give you face and let him see me." After that, he turned and walked into the main hall. Outside the study, Qin Ruing gently knocked on the door. After waiting for 2 seconds, she didn't hear any response, so she pushed the door open and went in. "Dad, it's time to eat." Qin Yongyan sat in the chair and stared at the desk in front of him. No one knew what he was thinking. Qin Ruing walked to his side. After glancing at the rice paper on the table, she read out the words he wrote on the paper. "The heavenly gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows back to the east. The green mountains on both sides of the river face each other. The lonely sail comes from the horizon." The words were good, and the poem was good. After reading, Qin Ruing gently put her hand on her father's shoulder. After a little hesitation, she asked uncertainly, "Dad, are you blaming me?" Qin Yongyan didn't say anything. Qin Ruing stood behind him silently. The expression on her face became more and more sad. Suddenly, Qin Yongyan let out a deep sigh. Then, he crumpled the rice paper on the table into a ball and threw it into the wastebasket next to him. Chapter 116. Family Banquet. Family and Banquet. The whole family sat together to eat. This was called a family banquet. Family banquets were so ordinary that there was nothing special about them. They just needed the whole family to sit together and have a happy meal. Wuxia was very big, so customs may be a little different from place to place. In some places, even the most high-end and expensive restaurant could not be regarded as the highest standard for receiving guests. The real highest standard was to invite the guest to the house for a seemingly ordinary home-cooked meal. Family banquet. Xianxia had never eaten a family banquet. The one he had eaten with Yingying before was called a couple's meal. Xianxia returned to the main hall and saw the little fellow standing on the chair, quietly eating the dishes on the table. She knew how to use chopsticks, but she didn't like to use them. Usually, she ate rice and soup, so she usually used a spoon. Xianxia served the main dish today. The little fellow tried a few times and found that she couldn't pick up the dishes, so she simply threw down the chopsticks and grabbed the dishes with her hands. Xianxia quietly walked not far from her and coughed softly. Because he was afraid of scaring her, Xianxia deliberately lowered his voice. But he didn't expect that such a small voice would startle the little fellow. She immediately threw away the braised goose slice in her hand in a panic. "Papa, I didn't steal it." As she spoke, the little fellow quickly wiped the oil on her mouth. Seeing that her hands and mouth were full of oil, Xianxia sat beside her, then took out a tissue and helped her wipe it carefully. As if afraid that her father would be angry, the little fellow immediately pouted and put on a pitiful look. Seeing this, Xianxia rubbed her head and said with a smile, "Good girl, eat when you're hungry. It's okay." As he spoke, Xianxia stood up and handed her the braised goose leg on the table. The little fellow was a little clever. She knew not to take the biggest and most conspicuous braised goose leg, but only some seemingly inconspicuous braised goose slices. "Papa is so nice." After receiving the braised goose leg, the little fellow was immediately overjoyed. She smiled so widely that flowers were about to bloom on her little face. After taking a big bite, she handed the braised goose back to Big Cat while chewing. She said with a lisp, "Big Cat, come, you eat too." Hearing this, the big cat quickly jumped to the little guy's side. After taking a bite, it started to meow. This fellow was a monster that had cultivated successfully, and the spiritual chi of heaven and earth had already washed away the filth on its body, so Xianxia didn't mind the little fellow eating with it. Xianxia waited for a moment. Seeing that she was happy, he pulled her to his side and looked into her eyes. He said seriously, "Ninian, promise me that you won't lie anymore. You can tell me whatever you want. As long as it's reasonable, I'll agree to it. Do you understand?" The little guy was stunned for a moment. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded gently and replied weakly with a pout, "Okay, I won't lie, good girl." Xianxia pinched her little face. At this time, Qin Xueqing also walked into the main hall. After seeing her sit down, Xianxia turned his head and looked in the direction of the study. To be honest, he still hadn't decided what kind of attitude he should use to face Qin Yongyan. Since ancient times, The relationship between father and son-in-law was slightly better than the relationship between mother and daughter-in-law. But this didn't mean that there wouldn't be conflicts between father and son-in-law. As the saying goes, the more a mother-in-law looks at her son-in-law, the more she likes him. However, there was no uniform way for a father-in-law to look at his son-in-law. Perhaps it was because mature men were more reserved, so they would hide some of their thoughts in their hearts and wouldn't make a conclusion easily. Even if they liked or disliked him, the father-in-law wouldn't easily express it. Before arriving home, Qin Ruing proposed to eat outside, but Xianxia said that he wanted to let her try his cooking. Qin Ruing couldn't persuade him, so there was this sumptuous meal in front of her. In fact, eating wasn't the main point. Meeting Yingying's father officially was the main point of this dinner. Chen Shi and Qin Yongyan, this father-in-law and son-in-law, had a very subtle relationship. Nian Yan was already 4 years old when Qin Yongyan just found out that he had a granddaughter. And as his son-in-law, Chen Shi showed his invincible power in the village in the morning, showing his absolute power that was beyond imagination. Everything that happened. What kind of experience would Qin Yongyan have? Chen Shi couldn't imagine it from his perspective. After all, he wasn't involved. Anyway, what's done is done, and he had finished eating. His father-in-law couldn't possibly ask him to spit it out, right? After waiting for a while, Qin Ruing and Qin Yongyan arrived. As soon as they walked into the main hall, Chen Shi was about to get up and greet them. Like Qin Xueqing, Chen Shi still hadn't figured out how to address Qin Yongyan. Yingying wasn't his legal wife after all. They were already engaged, so it wouldn't be good to call him dad directly. Nian Yan was already 4 years old, and she was still calling him grandpa sweetly. But he was calling Qin Yongyan uncle. Wouldn't that seem too distant? How should he address him? It was so annoying. Even an immortal would worry about such trivial matters. While Chen Shi was still worrying, Qin Yongyan's reaction immediately eased Chen Shi's awkwardness. Qin Yongyan followed Qin Ruing into the main hall. Seeing that Chen Shi was about to get up, he immediately stopped Chen Shi, and then said with a smile, "You've worked hard. Sit down." After that, he directly sat down at the head of the table in front of the red sandalwood carving table. After waiting for so long, the children must be hungry. Let's have a taste. Is the master's cooking as good as his swordsmanship? Qin Yongyan said with a smile, but quietly made a small joke with Chen Shi. As soon as he said that, Qin Xueqing's hand, which was about to pick up the chopsticks, suddenly trembled. She was a Wu Dao guru, but now even holding a pair of chopsticks was trembling. It was easy to imagine how complicated her feelings were right now. After all, she wasn't as shrewd and calm as Qin Yongyan. After secretly glancing at Chen Shi, she picked up the chopsticks and directly started to eat. At this time, Chen Shi got up and pushed the small bowl of golden wings to Qin Yongyan, and then said with a smile, "Sorry to make a fool of myself. This small bowl of golden wings is my specialty. Would you like to have a taste?" Then I won't stand on ceremony. Please." A seemingly ordinary family feast began amidst this harmonious atmosphere. During the banquet, Qin Yongyan kept chatting with Chen Shi about various trivial matters. Qin Ruing was responsible for serving the little girl. Only Qin Xueqing was restless and felt very awkward. After finishing the rice quickly, she immediately got up and said, "I'm full." "Uncle, sister, take your time." After that, Qin Xueqing turned to leave. However, at this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly stopped her and asked with a smile, "Xueqing, did you talk to your father on the phone?" Qin Xueqing nodded and replied, "Yes, they will come back after a while." Qin Yongyan nodded, but then suddenly pointed to her seat and said with a smile, "There are guests at home. You can be considered as half the host here. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Sit down for a while." Qin Xueqing looked at Qin Yongyan with a little surprise. Seeing that he was looking at her with a smile, Qin Xueqing couldn't help but hesitate for a moment, and then reluctantly sat down again. Chen Shi glanced at Qin Xueqing. After seeing her sit down, he suddenly said to Qin Yongyan, "Uncle Qin, sorry for calling you like this." Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately turned to look at Chen Shi. He still had a smile on his face. He just looked at Chen Shi with a smile and didn't say anything. Seeing this, Chen Shi also smiled. He gently held Qin Ruing's hand under the table, and then said with a smile, Nian Nian is already 4 years old, but I still owe Ying a romantic wedding, so I hope to hold this wedding for her under your witness. What do you think? Can you? Before Qin Yongyan could answer, Qin Ruing had already turned her head and looked at Xianxia in a daze. Wedding. She really never thought about it. Xianxia had actually been keeping this matter in her heart. Drinking wine and growing old together. Chapter 117. Wedding? Qin Ruing was stunned. That was something she had never dreamed of. Therefore, her first reaction was to avoid the trouble. But when she felt the warmth from Xianxia's hand, after hesitating for a while, she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. Which girl didn't yearn for love? Which teenager didn't fall in love? 20 years had passed and she was almost 30 years old. Her daughter was already 4 years old. Now that Xianxia suddenly said that he wanted to hold a wedding for her, why did it sound so awkward? It was very embarrassing. Oh? Have you decided when to hold it? As he spoke, Qin Yongyan looked at Qin Ruing with a faint smile. I can do it any time, it's up to Ying. With that, she turned to look at Qin Ruing. How would I know? Seeing that her father and husband were looking at her, Qin Ruing hurriedly lowered her head, looking a little embarrassed. She was stunned for a moment, then he seemed to have thought of something and couldn't help but laugh. He gently squeezed Qin Ruing's hand, then said to Qin Yongyan, I was dictatorial, I should have discussed with Ying first. Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately nodded and laughed. Then you have a good discussion, let me know when you are sure. After saying that, he continued to eat his food. His attitude was a little strange. Could it be? Father-in-law had already acquiesced to the fact that what was done, so he was mentally prepared in advance? She thought for a while, then threw this question to the back of his mind. He respected his father-in-law, but he wouldn't let his father-in-law's attitude affect his decision. The only person who could really affect his decision was Ying. She glanced at Qin Ruing. He felt that her palm was a little sweaty, so he couldn't help but gently stroke it. There are thousands of people in the world, but do not seek them for the fleeting clouds. A person is like a rainbow, meeting the top will be known. Treasure it as you go. After dinner, Qin Yongyan went straight to his study. Seeing him leave, Qin Xueqing ran back to her room in the east wing as if she was running away. Seeing this, the couple couldn't help but look at each other and shake their heads. Forget it, let's take it slow. Making a family banquet was actually a very tiring thing. Washing vegetables and cooking was very tiring. After eating, one still had to sweep the floor, mop the dishes, and wipe the table. Therefore, housewives sometimes had a hard time. As a good man of the new era, she had the awareness to become a househusband. Therefore, when Qin Ruing wanted to help him clean up, she was directly pushed out by Xianxia. He asked her to take care of the child and cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Shangjing is a city that never sleeps. Hohai, workers' sports complex, and Sanlitun are all bars, nightclubs, and food stalls. Hohai was very lively, but Dongming Alley, which was separated by a lake, was very quiet. This was the taste of old Shangjing. After cleaning up, when Xianxia returned to the west wing, the little fellow was lying in Qin Ruing's arms, giggling in front of the TV. When the little fellow saw Xianxia come in, she immediately sat up, patted the bed, and shouted, Papa! Papa, come and watch cartoons with me. Okay, Papa and Mama will watch with you. She got on the bed, and with Qin Ruing, one on the left and one on the right, the little girl was sandwiched between them. The little fellow looked to the left and then to the right. This was the first time she had enjoyed this kind of treatment, so she was immediately very excited. Therefore, she turned left and hugged Xianxia, and then turned right and hugged Qin Ruing. She tossed and turned on the bed, and was so happy that she didn't even want to watch cartoons. Looking at the little fellow who kept rolling on the bed, she suddenly turned his head and looked at Qin Ruing. The feeling of tacit understanding came again. Therefore, Xianxia let her play for a while. Seeing that she was too tired to turn over, Xianxia gently touched her little face and said seriously, Nian Nian, it's almost time for you to sleep. Hearing this, the little fellow immediately hugged Xianxia's arm, pouted, and said coquettishly, "I don't want to. I'm not sleepy, I want to play for a while more." She really slept too much today. It was only 9 o'clock, so the little fellow was full of energy and didn't feel sleepy at all. She helplessly pinched her face, and Qin Ruiying secretly laughed. Children are really ignorant. Hindrance, although he could use magic to make her sleep, Shi obviously wasn't in a hurry to do that, so he had to hold her and watch cartoons again. However, the animation on the children's channel was over, but the little fellow still didn't want to sleep. She had no choice but to order a Frozen movie for her. A Frozen movie lasted more than 90 minutes. When she finished watching, it was finally 12 o'clock. "Papa, I'm sleepy." The little fellow raised her little hand and yawned lazily with her mouth open, and finally wanted to sleep. She was afraid of waking her up, so for the first time, he didn't take her to brush her teeth and wash her face tonight. The little fellow held her father in one hand and her mother in the other, and soon fell asleep. After gently covering her with the quilt, she patted her forehead with a meditation spell. He sat up and said softly to the big cat, who was lying at the end of the bed, dozing off, "Big cat, go out and don't come back tonight." Meow. The big cat looked at him inexplicably. However, what responded to it was Shi's slightly murderous eyes. Meow. Seeing this, the big cat immediately jumped out. The door was closed, so just as it was about to jump up and open the door, Shi had already opened the door for it. The big cat was stunned for a moment, and then rushed out of the west wing at a faster speed. It was not good to stay here for a long time. After the big cat left, Shi picked up the little fellow and gently put her aside, then moved to Qin Ruiying's side and lay down. Qin Ruiying was lying on the bed, seeming a little nervous. As soon as Shi lay down beside her, she seemed to be stimulated and suddenly sat up from the bed. After hesitating for a moment, Qin Ruiying said with some embarrassment, "Nian is still next to us, she's asleep." "Aya." Qin Ruiying gently swatted away the devil's claws that wanted to play tricks. She bit her red lips and opened her mouth to say something, but Shi had already kissed her gently. She turned around to face the flowing snow, climbing onto the bed to hug the beautiful Tsong. Mandarin ducks dancing neck to neck, jadeite encirclement. Eyebrows together bashfully, lips red and warm. Fresh and fragrant, skin smooth and jade-like. Weak and languid wrists, so tender and lovable. Beads of sweat, messy green hair. After 1,000 years of happiness, I've heard of 5 nights of poverty. The time to linger is limited, the love is hard to end. It was the beginning of a break. Inying, do you want to try in the sky tomorrow? In the sky? Qin Ruiying was stunned for a moment, but then she shyly spat at him. "But, how can you think of that, shameless? We're an old married couple, what's there to be shy about?" Hearing that, Qin Ruiying pretended to be angry and threatened him, "I'm going to be angry." Seeing that, Shi immediately raised his hands to surrender. I won't say it." The two of them lingered for a while. Shi hugged her and suddenly asked seriously, "Inying, are you looking forward to our wedding?" Qin Ruiying looked at him quietly in the dark and did not answer immediately. She gently leaned her head on Shi's chest. Then, with a sense of relief, she suddenly sighed and said, "I didn't dare to think about it before, so I never thought about it. Thank you." Chapter 118. After the couple spent some time together, the date of the wedding was finally set. December 12th, half a month later. There was no special meaning to it. She just wanted to do it as soon as possible, so he chose December 12th after thinking about it. 12-12, 1-2-2, I wanna love. It felt good and auspicious, so let's do it on that day. Qin Ruiying gave it some thought and let him make the decision. In fact, she didn't have any special ideas, thinking that it just needed to be simple. As long as she could marry Shi under the witness of her father, she would have no regrets in this life. However, Shi also wanted to hold a romantic wedding for Inying because he had experienced Fong Lei's high-end cruise wedding. Qin Ruiying didn't agree. Not to mention that Shi was all alone, even she didn't have many relatives or friends. So even if the wedding was grand, how many guests could they invite to attend the ceremony? It was a make-up wedding anyway, so it was fine to just give her a simple blessing. Xianxia agreed with her with a smile. The next day, when the little girl woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Xianxia leaned against the bed and looked at her with a smile. The little girl didn't seem to be awake yet. She stretched, squinted at her father next to her, and then rolled on the bed directly into Xianxia's arms to continue to sleep. The couple sat side by side on the bed, quietly looking at the little girl who was sleeping in Xianxia's arms. Suddenly, they looked at each other again. Then they both laughed. Maybe this was the happiest thing in the world. These 2 days, there would be light snow from time to time. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make the snow pile on the ground higher and higher. The weather was good today. After the snow at night, it was sunny during the day. Qin Shuecheng might feel that it was not good to eat Xianxia's food for free every day, so when Xianxia went to the kitchen, he found that she had already bought breakfast and put it in the thermal cabinet. His sister-in-law was actually a very domineering person. However, her brother-in-law was stronger than her. She was so domineering that she could no longer raise her head in front of Xianxia. Because the little fellow had gone back to sleep, it was already 9 o'clock in the morning by the time Qin Ruing took her to wash up and get up for breakfast. Her sister-in-law was a very particular person, so the breakfast she bought was naturally not the porridge and steamed buns from the roadside stalls. He didn't know where she bought these Cantonese morning snacks, but just looking at them was enough to whet his appetite. Because they woke up too late, Qin Shuecheng and Qin Yongyan had already eaten, so Xianxia directly took the breakfast back to the West Wing. The little girl liked barbecued pork buns and shrimps very much. After taking a bite of each dish, the little girl held the roast pork bun in one hand and the shumai prawn in the other. Her mouth was as big as a squirrel stealing pine nuts, but she didn't forget to nod and praise the deliciousness. Perhaps it was because the weather was too cold, so after breakfast, the little girl ran to the bed again to watch cartoons. This was a bad habit. So under Xianxia's strong request, she had to obediently follow Xianxia to the yard and prepare to build a snowman with her father. However, perhaps it was because Xianxia had built a super large snowman for her before. Therefore, the little girl didn't want to build anymore after a while, because she was afraid of the cold now. Xianxia was a little speechless, so he had to begin to reflect on whether there was something wrong with his education of his child. He felt that Nian Nian was becoming more and more disobedient now. Especially after Qin Ruing came back, she often acted coquettishly and wanted to watch cartoons. And the person she acted coquettishly to was not him. It had only been a day, but she was getting closer and closer to her mother. It was probably because Qin Ruing had just seen her daughter, so she wanted to be obedient to her. If Xianxia hadn't stopped her, Qin Ruing would have even taken her back to watch cartoons. She was afraid of the cold and didn't want to stay outside, but when she entered the house, she wanted to watch cartoons. This cartoon definitely couldn't be watched. It was not right to be cooped up at home all day, so she had to exercise. So, Xianxia called the big cat. This guy was comfortable in bed last night, but was suddenly driven to the main hall by Xianxia to be exposed to the cold wind. Now, it was still full of resentment. But when Xianxia called it, it didn't dare to disagree, so after a meow, it ran over obediently. You change back and take Nian Nian to run a few laps in the yard. Meow. The big cat was a little reluctant, and tried to protest with a few meows. Protest was invalid, so it could only obediently change back. This trick was effective. When the little girl saw the big cat change back to its original form, she was immediately attracted. Without Xianxia's reminder, she quickly rushed over and hugged the big cat. The big cat was very cooperative, and the little girl sat on it very skillfully. Big cat, let's go. Go, go, go. Obviously, it was the big cat doing the work, but because the little girl was too excited, she kept shouting, so it didn't take long for her to be tired and gasping for breath. Xianxia stood on the steps outside the West Wing, looked at the little girl running in the yard, and then looked at his lonely wife beside him. Suddenly, he felt that he might already be the happiest person in the world. Winner in life? This feeling was really good. Xianxia looked up at the sky. The wind and snow had just stopped, and the sky in Shangjing was as blue as it was on National Day. Was this the feeling of happiness? After the washing of time, after the lights waned, one would understand the preciousness of dullness. Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but gently hold Qin Ruoying's hand. He suddenly turned to her and said, "Ying, I suddenly have a new life goal." Life goal? Hearing this, Qin Ruoying looked at him with some doubts. Seeing his serious face, she immediately couldn't help but chuckle and say, "It's broad daylight, don't make trouble." She thought that Xianxia was going to play a joke on her again. However, Xianxia looked at her quietly for a few seconds, but suddenly said to her very seriously, "Ying, I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it's—" Speaking of this, he suddenly paused, and then solemnly said the time limit he wanted. "Eternal life. I hope you can be by my side forever. Together with me, we'll see the end of time." Qin Ruoying was stunned. But then, she threw herself into Xianxia's arms, just like in the school playground, and took the initiative to raise her head and kiss Xianxia's mouth. After a long time, the two reluctantly let go of each other. Qin Xueqing stood outside the east wing, watching them show their love and scrupulously in public, and immediately snorted angrily. At this time, the little fellow rode Big Cat to her side. The little fellow raised her little head again and asked sweetly, "Aunt, do you want to play with me?" Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment. Then she touched her little head and said softly, "No, you have fun with Big Cat." "But, Big Cat, let's play." After watching the little fellow ride Big Cat away, Qin Xueqing hesitated again, and then quickly walked through the yard to the steps outside the west wing. She raised her head slightly. Chapter 119. The timing of the sister-in-law's request was very strange. Xianxia had just finished showing off his affection with her sister, and she was asking for guidance. However, her tone was not very polite, as if she felt that asking Xianxia for guidance was a very embarrassing thing. Her stiff attitude made it impossible for others to feel her sincerity. Sister-in-law was arrogant. Xianxia lowered his head and looked at her, but did not answer immediately. At this time, Qin Ruoying suddenly squeezed his hand slightly, clearly reminding him to answer quickly. Before the husband said anything, the wife had already started to whisper pillow talk. Xianxia smiled and looked at Qin Ruoying. Then, under Qin Xueqing's slightly expectant gaze, he suddenly shook his head and said softly, "No." Qin Xueqing was stunned. Qin Ruoying was also stunned. The two sisters looked at Xianxia in disbelief. They obviously did not expect Xianxia to refuse. Obvious Jing, inward Jing, peak Jing, Dan stage, Alcade stage, invincible stage, diviner stage. Xianxia was already standing at the peak of this world. Those who had reached the controlled Dan stage were called grandmasters. But after reaching the grandmaster stage, Qin Xueqing realized how difficult it was to go further. Xianxia was a diviner. As long as he casually gave her some guidance, it would definitely be a great help to her. Her idea was good, but she really did not expect that Xianxia would refuse her directly in front of her sister. Qin Xueqing became angrier and angrier the more she thought about it. In a fit of anger, she immediately turned around and walked back to the east wing. Qin Ruoying knew her sister's temper, so she immediately pulled Xianxia, wanting to intercede for her sister. However, before she could say anything, Xianxia sighed softly and suddenly stopped Qin Xueqing. "I have never learned martial arts. How do you want me to give you guidance? Why don't you show it to me first?" Hearing this, Qin Xueqing immediately stopped. She was a Wu Dao grandmaster, but now she was asking for guidance from a necromancer. It did seem a little unreasonable. However, Xianxia was ultimately at the celestial being realm. His horizons were definitely not something that ordinary people could compare to. Thus, after thinking for a while, Qin Wanqing turned around and said, "Okay, I'll play it for you first." After saying that, she walked to the center of the courtyard and got into a starting position. The Qin clan's inherited martial art, Mother-Child Soft Palm. The Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 9 forms, and each form had 6 variations. There were a total of 54 forms, and each form had a molecular variation. Therefore, the Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 108 forms. In the small courtyard, in a slightly tipsy winter day, Qin Xueqing proudly stands alone, holding her breath. As a grandmaster of the dance stage, she had long cultivated the martial Tao from the vocal realm to the silent realm. Suddenly she moved. Her lotus steps moved slightly, and her posture was exquisite beyond compare. Light clouds danced gracefully as her sleeves fluttered in the wind. Suddenly she was as ethereal as a light cloud, and suddenly she was like a magpie startling its nest. A set of mother-child cotton palm, which was soft but firm, came out from her hands. It was not like a martial art, but more like a dance. As it fluttered and danced, it was like a snow lotus blooming angrily. The little fellow who was riding the big cat and wandering around was attracted by her dance, so she immediately rode the big cat back to Xianxia's side. She looked up and asked, "Papa, is Auntie dancing?" Xianxia bent down and picked her up from the big cat, and then asked with a smile, "How is it? Is Auntie dancing well?" The little fellow immediately nodded heavily, and suddenly said with some expectation, "I also want to learn." Hearing this, Xianxia kissed her little face and laughed. "Auntie is dancing the mortal dance. When you grow up, Papa will teach you the immortal dance and let you become a fairy like Sister Chang. Okay? But teach me, Papa." The little fellow put her arms around Xianxia's neck and immediately giggled. The 108 moves were soon finished. Xianxia stopped and stood still. She raised her head and looked at Xianxia again with some expectation in her eyes. Xianxia did not speak immediately, because after seeing Xianxia's performance, he suddenly remembered the moves that great-granduncle used when fighting with him. It was beyond the scope of martial arts. The environment of the earth was not suitable for cultivation, so martial arts itself was a deformed product under the influence of the environment. This was a dead end. There was no way ahead. However, great-granduncle had obviously found another way. Therefore, after pondering for a while, Xianxia looked at Xianxia and said softly, "That's it. I'll think about it first and give you an answer tomorrow." Xianxia looked at Xianxia with a complicated expression, and then turned back to her room in the east wing. After his sister left, Xianxia turned to look at Xianxia and suddenly asked thoughtfully, "You're so powerful now, is it because of that place in your memory?" She had seen Xianxia's memory. Although it was only the first few years, it was enough for her to understand that there was a place called the Heavenly Jade Domain in this world. The people there were very powerful. Xianxia looked at Xianxia. Seeing her worried look, he could not help but smile. "It's a very long story. Let's go, I'll tell you slowly." The couple brought the little fellow back to the west wing. Then, Xianxia told Xianxia the story that had lasted for 500 years. Heavenly Jade Domain, Immortal Cultivators. Heavenly Domain, Heavenly Yen Sect. Odd Job Disciple, Dawn Divine Lord. Starting from the Heavenly Jade Domain, he entered the Heavenly Yen Sect and became an odd job disciple. In the end, he stood out from countless odd job disciples and became an official disciple of the Divine Sect, officially beginning his path of cultivation. The story was very long and very unbelievable, so Xianxia could only tell the main points. Xianxia became more and more confused as she listened, until she heard Xianxia say that he had lived in the Heavenly Jade Domain for a full 500 years. She could not help but open her mouth and say in shock, 500 years? She originally thought that Xianxia had only gone to a mysterious place like a village to learn cultivation. Only now did she finally understand. Xianxia had gone to another world. A place infinitely far away from Earth. A place where the flow of time was completely different from Earth. It was too unbelievable. Xianxia digested it for a long time, but she still could not accept it. What she cared about was not the immortal cultivators, nor the Heavenly Jade Domain. What she cared about was the 500 years that Xianxia said. She had lost Xianxia for 5 years. But Xianxia had lost her for a full 500 years? A person living alone in a completely unfamiliar place for 500 years? And after 500 years, Xianxia still remembered her? After going through so much, just to come back and find her? Xianxia stared at Xianxia in a daze. She would not doubt his words, which was why she felt that it was somewhat unacceptable. What did 500 years mean? Xianxia really could not imagine it. She stared at the lover in front of her in a daze. Suddenly, She seemed to understand what Xianxia meant by eternal life. Xianxia looked at Qin. When he saw her dazed expression, he immediately regretted it. He really should not have told Yingying such an unbelievable thing. He should have optimized this story and told her in a way that Yingying could understand. Xianxia regretted it a little. However, the next moment, Qin suddenly threw herself into his arms. She looked up at her lover's face and suddenly burst into tears. I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it is. Chapter 120. Immortality. It was the ultimate dream of countless people, but it was obviously impossible to achieve. Although cultivators had a long lifespan, compared to immortality, what was a few hundred years? Xianxia was in the deification stage, so his lifespan could reach at least 2,000 years. This also led to a problem in front of him. After all, Qin was just a mortal. Living over 100 years old was already a long life. Xianxia could live for 2,000 years, but Qin couldn't accompany him for 2,000 years. 5 years was enough for time to leave a trace of imperceptible traces on her face. Let alone 2,000 years? After going through so many hardships, he finally found his lover. Would he have to watch her wither in his arms after a few decades? Xianxia would never allow such a thing to happen. Absolutely not. He had no delusions about immortality. Because he knew that immortality was an unrealistic fantasy. No one could live forever, but if it was only a few decades, Xianxia felt that it was too little. So he wanted to help Yingying borrow another 500 years from the heavens. A cultivator in the gold core stage could have a lifespan of 500 years. Therefore, the moment this idea appeared in Xianxia's mind, it took root and sprouted almost immediately, growing into a towering tree. He must help Yingying reach the gold core stage. Although the spiritual aura of heaven and earth was thin, there were still hidden masters who were close to the gold core stage like great-granduncle. Without the inheritance of cultivators, great-granduncle could reach this step. What's more, he was holding Qin hand and walking. She was just a gold core. Thinking of this, Xianxia immediately guided Qin to find the sense of qi. To become a cultivator, the first step was to find the sense of qi. Only after detecting the existence of the spiritual aura of heaven and earth could one use a secret method to refine the spiritual aura into one's own true essence and gather it in one's dantian. If one couldn't even detect the spiritual aura of heaven and earth, then what was the point of cultivating? The sense of qi was a mysterious feeling beyond the 5 senses. There were some talented individuals who didn't even need anyone to teach them. They could awaken their sense of qi when they were still in their infancy and instinctively refine the qi of heaven and earth. However, such geniuses were rarely seen. Therefore, if one really wanted to talk about it, humans, who were the wisest of all living things, were inferior to demons in this aspect. For example, Big Cat. It was originally a wild leopard that lived in the mountains. One day, when it suddenly awakened its sense of qi, it relied on its instincts and slowly stepped into the spirit-gathering stage. As more and more spirit qi accumulated, the big cat naturally reached the wisdom realm. Now that it had gained sentience, it could be considered to have truly stepped onto the path of cultivation. It was impossible for Xianxia to hide anything from Qin. Therefore, he took out the best cultivation technique he had, the treasure of the Sky Yen Divine Sect, the Sky Yen Divine Canon. The cultivation method is the best, but Qin doesn't know what's wrong with her. She tosses and turns for a whole night but still can't find any qi. It was true that the spiritual energy on earth was sparse. However, the person sitting next to her is a spirit formation stage expert. Xianxia even used his own true essence to completely wrap her up. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that every breath she took was pure true essence that had been refined by Xianxia. It was even purer than the original heaven and earth spirit qi. However, even so, Qin still can't find any qi. To find the qi, a slower person would need a few hours, while a faster person would only need a few minutes. For example, Xianxia's method of using true essence to directly wrap her up is practically cheating. Unfortunately, she still can't feel it. There's no other way. Xianxia doesn't want to give her too much pressure, so he can only lie to her and say that everything is difficult at the beginning and let her try again tomorrow morning. Qin Ring can't even be considered as a martial artist, her physical strength is already weak. After tossing and turning for an entire night, she is also tired, so she didn't suspect anything and fell asleep while hugging Xianxia. The next day, Qin Xueqing bought breakfast as usual. After breakfast, Xianxia took the little fellow to do morning exercises in the courtyard. Qin Ring stayed in the house to continue to search for the qi. However, until lunchtime, Qin Ring still can't find the qi. At this time, Xianxia can't help but feel anxious. Immortal cultivators are divided into realms, and every time a cultivator crosses a major realm, they will have an extraordinary transformation. However, the advancement of this realm is extremely difficult. Many people with mediocre aptitude may even be trapped in the qi refinement stage for their entire lives, and can't make any progress. He has been in the Tianyuan world for more than 500 years, and he has never heard of anyone who can't find the qi. If you can't find the qi and can't even enter the door, what kind of cultivator are you? Could it be? Is it because the cultivation methods of the Tianyuan world can't be used on Earth? Thinking of this, Xianxia immediately found Qin Xueqing, and then taught her a set of ordinary cultivation methods. Qin Xueqing thought that Xianxia taught her the cultivation method of the necromancer, so she immediately began to search for the qi according to what he said. However, Qin Xueqing and Qin Ring are in the same situation. The two of them struggled until the afternoon, but still couldn't find the qi that Xianxia was talking about. If they can't find the qi, it means that they can't cultivate. The matter is a bit serious. Xianxia hesitated for a moment, and then took the set of cultivation methods to Qin Yongyan, and prepared to let his father-in-law try it. Qin Yongyan is also a Dan stage grandmaster. After seeing how powerful Xianxia is, he has always been very interested in Xianxia's cultivation methods. So now that Xianxia came to him with the cultivation methods, Qin Yongyan immediately smiled and practiced according to what he said. The same treatment as Qin Xueqing. As soon as Qin Yongyan closed his eyes, Xianxia wrapped him with vital essence. However, after a few seconds, Qin Yongyan suddenly opened his eyes and chuckled. Is this the qi sense you were talking about? It's really a strange feeling. You feel it? Xianxia's expression changed abruptly. He immediately withdrew his vital essence, and then asked nervously, then try again. See if you can absorb the surrounding spiritual qi into your body through this set of cultivation methods. Okay, I'll try. Qin Yongyan sat cross-legged on the ground with his hands on his knees, and then practiced according to the cultivation methods given by Xianxia. Xianxia looked at Qin Yongyan nervously. After about 10 minutes, Xianxia suddenly felt that the spiritual qi around Qin Yongyan began to flow slowly. Although it was extremely weak, it proved that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation methods. He could cultivate. Since there was no problem with the incantation, then what was the problem? With a stomach full of doubts, Xianxia quickly returned to the west wing. Qin Ring was sitting on the bed, trying hard to find the qi. After hearing Xianxia say that cultivation could prolong life, she was completely moved. After all, if possible, who wouldn't want to live a few more years? She worked very hard, because she also wanted to be with Xianxia forever, until the end of time. The little girl sat on the bed, watching cartoons while curiously looking at Xianxia and Qin Ring. Chapter 121. Since Qin Yongyan could cultivate it, it meant that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation technique itself. The Sky Yen God sect's cultivation technique was based on righteousness and there were no shortcuts. However, it was a path that led straight to the Mahayana realm. Of the two cultivation techniques, one was the foundational cultivation technique for new disciples and the other was the Sky Yen God sect's secret scripture. However, to cultivators in the qi refinement stage, there was no difference between the two cultivation techniques. The great Tao flowed like mercury and every grain was round. It was impossible for the Sky Yen God sect to keep their cultivation techniques to themselves. Allowing new disciples to cultivate incomplete foundational cultivation techniques was undoubtedly a foolish method of self-destruction. Qin Yongyan could cultivate it, But Qin Ruing and Qin Xueqing could not sense qi. This made Qin Shi very suspicious. If it was not a problem with the cultivation technique, could it be gender? However, that was obviously impossible. The Sky Yen God scripture did not have any requirements to be passed down to males and not females. As the sect master's daughter, Yu Zijin had cultivated the Sky Yen God scripture earlier than him. Before Chen Shi left, Yu Zijin had already successfully stepped into the divine transformation stage and was given the title of Goddess Zijin. What exactly was the problem? Chen Shi stood beside Qin Ruing and looked at his lover's diligent appearance. The pressure in his heart increased. He could help her refine pills to forcefully raise her cultivation, but that would be meaningless. Was it really that difficult to sense qi? Chen Shi was at a loss. At this moment, the little guy who was sitting on the bed was suddenly amused by the cartoon and laughed a series of loud laughter. Chen Shi looked at the little fellow. After thinking for a while, he came to the little fellow's side and asked softly, "Nian, can you help Daddy with something?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately jumped into Chen Shi's arms and laughed. "Okay. What can I help Daddy with?" Sit properly first and then follow Daddy's instructions to sense. Under Chen Shi's guidance, the little guy assumed a proper posture with his 5 hearts facing the sky. After that, Chen Shi gently rapped her with his true yuan. "Nian, use your heart to sense. Are there many things floating around you like dandelions?" The little fellow obediently closed her eyes and sensed for a while, but she did not feel anything. Thus, she wrinkled her little nose and sniffed around, like a cute puppy sniffing around. Chen Shi looked at her appearance and knew that she was unable to calm her heart. Nian was still too young and it seemed like she was unable to understand what he meant. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but sigh, ready to give up. He was 2. He actually wanted to let a child to try. However, the little fellow's happy's true. "Daddy, I see a lot of the bubbles." She did not swaz, it was that she was with her eyes was with Lin. The little fellow happily stretched out her fingers and kept poking in the air. Seeing this, Chen Shi was stunned. Nian, this naughty little girl, could sense the qi? Because he was a little suspicious of the little fellow's feeling, Chen Shi deliberately scattered his true yuan and guided her to find it. However, what Chen Shi did not expect was that the little fellow could actually accurately point out the location of each ball of true yuan. "It's so fun! It's so fun!" The little guy closed his eyes and started to shout happily. In the darkness, she felt that there were countless glowing bubbles around her, slowly flowing around her. Chen Shi withdrew his true yuan. The spiritual qi of heaven and earth was too thin, so the moment he withdrew his true yuan, the little fellow immediately lost her sense of the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. "Daddy, it's gone. The bubbles are gone." The little fellow pouted and opened her eyes. Then she lay on the bed, looking for the bubbles that came out of nowhere. Chen Shi looked at the little fellow silently. He would not consider letting the little fellow start cultivating for the time being. After all, Nian was only a 4-year-old child, and this was not the Tianyuan world. In the future, Nian would have to go to school. Chen Shi did not want her to become an anomaly. An anomaly among children would be ostracized. After coaxing the little fellow to watch cartoons, Chen Shi looked at Qin Ruing. If even Nian could cultivate, then there was obviously something wrong with the 2 sisters. At this time, Qin Ruing had already stopped cultivating. She heard the little fellow's movements. Seeing that her daughter could immediately find the feeling that Chen Shi said, Qin Ruing's face darkened. She said sadly, "Maybe I'm too stupid." Hearing this, Chen Shi sat beside her, gently held her hand and comforted her. "Everything is difficult at the beginning. Children are the spirits of heaven and earth and have not been affected by the turbid qi of the world, so it's easier for them to find that feeling than adults." In order to prevent her from doubting him, Chen Shi even used his sister-in-law as an example to comfort her. "You're not stupid, and neither is Hua Qing." Hua Qing reached the martial Dao master realm in her 20s. She's already a rare martial arts genius in this world. Even a genius like her can't find the qi, let alone you, an ordinary person who has never cultivated before. "Don't worry, don't pressure, let's take it slow." "Okay, then I'll try again." After hearing Chen Shi's words, Qin Ruoying immediately relaxed a lot. Even Hua Qin could not learn it. It could be seen that what Xianxia taught them must be much more difficult than martial arts. Therefore, it was normal for her not to be able to learn it in a short time. Thinking of this, Qin Ruoying immediately relaxed a lot. After smiling at Xianxia, she closed her eyes and began to cultivate again. However, she was no longer stressed, but the pressure in Xianxia's heart was increasing. After leaving a ball of vital essence to gently wrap her up, Xianxia quietly walked out of the west wing and then went to the main room to find Qin Yongyan. The Qin family's courtyard house was on the west coast of Shikahai. A little further down was the center of Wuxia's power, Xianxia. Xianxia had been back on Earth for so long. Based on the places he had been to so far, Zhongnanhai's spirit energy was only second to Qinling. It was definitely an excellent place to cultivate in seclusion. Qin Yongyan had been sitting in the main room cultivating. After tossing and turning for the whole afternoon, when Xianxia once again walked into the main room, she could even see a trace of cloud rising around Qin Yongyan's body. This was the manifestation of the condensed spirit energy of heaven and earth. It also meant that Qin Yongyan had begun to try to refine the spirit energy of heaven and earth. Xianxia did not tell Qin Yongyan the truth. He simply described the problem that the sisters were facing now. Qin Yongyan was very smart. Therefore, he immediately understood that Xianxia was hinting him not to mention cultivation in front of the sisters, so as not to bring unnecessary psychological pressure to them. Xianxia was in charge of dinner. After the meal was served, under Xianxia's constant urging, Qin Xueqing reluctantly walked out of the east wing. However, after she was at the table, she just ate 2 mouthfuls and then said that she was full. After that, she quickly returned to the east wing, closed the door, and continued to cultivate. Her sister-in-law was obsessed with martial arts. Otherwise, she could not have reached the dance stage at this age. Xianxia showed her a new way, so now she was in high spirits. She must find the qi sense that Xianxia mentioned. Perhaps it was due to her sister's influence, but Qin Ruoying's mood gradually improved. Xianxia knew what she was thinking, so he patted his chest and said that in the future, he would take care of the children and do the housework. She only needed to concentrate on cultivating. Hearing this, Qin Ruoying went back to her room and continued to cultivate. There were only 3 people left in the main hall. Xianxia and Qin Yongyan ate silently, while the little fellow took care of the big cat very generously. At this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly glanced at Xianxia without a trace. He faintly felt that. Chapter 122. The next morning, Qin Xueqing didn't buy breakfast today, so Xianxia went to the roadside stall and bought some. This time, he didn't buy steamed buns, but jianbing fruits for the little fellow. The little fellow had been eating Cantonese morning snacks for 2 days. Xianxia thought that her appetite would be very picky, so he bought jianbing fruits just to let her have a taste. If she really didn't like it, he would have to cook it himself. However, what Xianxia didn't expect was that the little fellow was instantly interested in the jianbing fruits after getting them. She held the oiled paper bag, opened her mouth wide, and took a big bite. Her little face was immediately covered with a lot of sauce. The little fellow frowned and chewed hard. After chewing for a while, she suddenly handed the jianbing fruits to Xianxia and laughed. "Delicious! Papa, eat it." Because of the existence of the big cat, she had now developed a good habit of sharing with others all the time. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled and touched her head. He said softly, "Good girl, you are delicious. Don't get oil all over your body." But, nodding, the little fellow took the jianbing fruits and fed them to the big cat. At this time, Xianxia turned to look at Qin Ruoying. Qin Ruoying just ate a few mouthfuls casually. Now she was sitting on the bed and cultivating again. It was not right to say that she was cultivating, because she hadn't even entered the door. Now she was still at the stage of looking for qi. This was actually a very boring thing, but in order to keep up with Xianxia's pace, she had to work hard. Xianxia saw it all in her eyes. He was obviously very anxious in his heart, but he had to act as if nothing had happened, which really made him a little uncomfortable. Xianxia checked Qin Ruoying's physical condition. She was very healthy and there was no problem. Except for the lack of qi, everything was perfect. If Qin Ruing couldn't find qi, it was normal. In that case, it was unreasonable that Qin Xueqing couldn't find the sense of qi. She was a clasping Dan master after all, and her 5 senses were much better than normal people. She could even perfectly control her own body, down to her skin and internal organs. But even so, Qin Xueqing still couldn't feel the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. A dignified martial Dao grandmaster was actually inferior to a 4-year-old child. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. Chen Shi was afraid that the truth would shock them, so he could only emphasize to them how difficult it was to find qi. As for Qin Yongyan, he could clearly see that there was something wrong with the two of them, so he simply hid in his room all day and silently cultivated. The morning passed quickly. Qin Ring, Qin Xueqing, and Qin Yongyan basically wouldn't show up except for mealtimes. The little girl was very sensible. After hearing that her mother was studying, she did not disturb her mother. After lunch, Qin Shi thought about it for a while and went out with the little fellow. Their destination was the largest Chinese medicine wholesale market in Shangjing. He had bought so many herbs in Zhonghai before, and he didn't expect to have to buy them again so soon. For his wife and sister-in-law, Qin Shi was now going all out. So when he took the little fellow to the Chinese medicine market, he wasted millions again. Spirit Gathering Pill. It was an entry-level pill that could allow qi refining stage cultivators to quickly accumulate qi. Because of the lack of a few core ingredients, the effect of the pill might be greatly reduced like the simplified version of the Spirit Gathering Pill. Chen Shi really didn't have a solution for their current situation, so he could only put all his hopes on the pill. Maybe after they ate the Spirit Gathering Pill, they would be able to sense the spiritual qi of heaven and earth after having true qi in their bodies. The idea was not bad, and it was worth a try. So Qin Shi waited until midnight. After the truck brought the herbs he needed, he immediately began to make the Spirit Gathering Pill in the yard. In order to improve the effect of the pill, Qin Shi even directly poured true qi into it. Although it wasn't much, it should be able to slightly increase the effect of the pill. Alchemy was a very time-consuming thing, so when he finally finished making the Spirit Gathering Pill, Qin Ruing had already fallen into a deep sleep. Looking at his wife's diligent appearance for the past 2 days, Chen Shi couldn't help but be angry and anxious. He was very irritated, so he simply went to the yard and started to set up a formation. With the Qin family's courtyard as the foundation, he gathered all the spiritual qi around Zhonghai. Spirit gathering, qi concealing, defense, 3 formations in one. It could be considered as opening up an excellent place for them to cultivate. Frost and snow night, cold wind blew. Dongming Alley was peaceful and tranquil, a stark contrast to the noisy Hohai bar. Chen Shi stood alone on the roof of the main hall, looking at the cold crescent moon. His heart was filled with endless anxiety. No matter what, he had to let Yingying step into the Oris core stage. He stood there for an entire night. It wasn't until the sun rose from the east, and when a hazy glimmer appeared on the horizon, that Qin Shi knocked on his sister-in-law's door. His sister-in-law was a master. She only needed to rest for 2 hours a day, so when Qin Shi knocked on the door, she had already started cultivating. Chen Shi handed her a Spirit Gathering Pill. She didn't ask any questions, directly swallowed it, then returned to her room to continue cultivating. Chen Shi, on the other hand, stood outside the door, silently sensing the movements in her room. There was still something wrong. Even though the Spirit Gathering Pill didn't have an immediate effect, but shouldn't there be some reaction? Why wasn't there any movement at all? Chen Shi anxiously paced back and forth in the yard. After an unknown amount of time, the little fellow slowly woke up. Chen Shi hurriedly ran to buy breakfast, then helped her get up and wash up. Qin Ruoying sat on the bed and looked at Qin Shi, who had finished her work. Suddenly she sighed softly. After all, he was the one who slept beside her. So no matter how well Qin Shi hid it, Qin Ruoying still keenly sensed that something was wrong with him. But she didn't say anything. After a simple breakfast, she silently sat on the bed and continued cultivating. Chen Shi fed her the Spirit Gathering Pill, indicating that she should relax, then went to find Qin Yongyan again. At this time, Qin Yongyan had already successfully cultivated a trace of true essence. Even though it was very small, It represented that he had become a true cultivator. Xianxia hesitated for a moment, but still handed the spirit-gathering pill to him. Hearing Xianxia say that it was helpful for cultivation, Qin Yongyan immediately swallowed it. The spirit-gathering pill melted in his mouth. Qin Yongyan was stunned for a moment, then hurriedly sat cross-legged. Xianxia stood next to him, silently sensing the changes in the spirit qi around him. 10 minutes later, Xianxia came to the courtyard. He looked at the west wing, then looked at the east wing. Then he turned around and looked at the main hall. The door of the main hall was wide open. From his position, he could just see the large red sandalwood table carved with dragons. On top of the table was Li Bai's, gazing at the Heavenly Gate mountain. The Heavenly Gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows east. Suddenly, a murderous aura suddenly exploded from his body. A formless energy quickly spread out with him as the center. It was as if a stone had suddenly been dropped into a calm water surface, causing ripples to appear one after another. Crack! In the small courtyard, the blue stone slabs shattered. Following that, the ground beneath his feet suddenly sank nearly a foot deep. Xianxia looked up at the sky with a gloomy face. He finally knew why. Qin Ruiying, Qin Xueqing. Chapter 123. Sai Courtyard. The blue stone floor in the inner courtyard was completely shattered, and the ground strangely sank nearly a foot deep. Because it was covered by snow, when the ground broke, it did not raise too much smoke and dust. Xianxia stood in the middle of the courtyard silently. This movement also alarmed the others in the courtyard. The little fellow was the first to run out. When she came out of the door, she saw the movement made by Xianxia. Wow! The scene in front of her completely shocked the little fellow. She opened her small mouth and opened her eyes wide, looking around curiously. The courtyard seemed to have been hit by a meteor. The closer to the center of the courtyard, the deeper the ground collapsed. The originally flat bluestone floor had been completely destroyed, and the collapse of the ground also caused a lot of soil to be turned up. It looked like the scene of a forced demolition. The little fellow stepped forward and carefully walked down the steps. She was very smart. She knew that the bluestone floor could not be stepped on, so she carefully stepped on the mud, and then by holding her hands flat to maintain her balance, she moved closer to Xianxia step by step. Because it was winter, the soil was frozen very tightly, so it became very slippery. If she was not careful, she would slip. The more she moved forward, the more difficult it was to move forward. The little fellow took only 2 steps forward, and suddenly she staggered and almost slipped. She waved her little hands and tried to maintain her balance, but after standing firm, she did not dare to move forward. Therefore, she had to stand there honestly, pouting and shouting timidly, "Papa?" Her voice was very small, but it suddenly pulled Xianxia's thoughts back. Xianxia hurriedly turned her head to look, just in time to see the little girl's pitiful appearance, so she quickly came to her side and directly carried her up. Xianxia carried her back to the steps of the west wing, and the little fellow lay on his body, constantly looking back at the scene in the center of the courtyard. With her current experience, she obviously could not understand what was going on, so she could only ask with some doubts, "Papa, what's going on?" "Well, it's nothing. It was a small earthquake just now." "What is an earthquake?" Xianxia choked on her question. After thinking about it, he held the little fellow and shook her up and down. Then, he said with a smile, "This is an earthquake." Little Rascal's head was shaking from his shaking, even more than when he was riding Big Cat. However, perhaps it was because of the experience of riding the big cat that the little guy did not seem to be afraid even under such violent shaking. Instead, he hugged Xianxia's head and shouted, "This is so fun." Hearing this, Xianxia hurriedly stopped what he was doing, and then warned with a serious expression, "That's not right. Not fun at all. Earthquakes are very scary. When it happens, you have to hide in a safe place, such as the kitchen, the corner of the bathroom, or under the table. Do you understand?" "Oh." Seeing the serious look on Xianxia's face, the little fellow immediately stopped laughing and nodded, pretending to be serious. After emphasizing the dangers of earthquakes to her, Xianxia put the little fellow down, and then told her that it was fine here, and asked her to go play with the big cat. After all, the little girl was still young, so when she heard her father's words, she simply thought that it wasn't a big deal. Thus, she threw the scene in front of her to the back of her mind and ran back to the West Wing to continue watching cartoons. The three people of the Qin family had already heard the noise and came to the courtyard. After his daughter ran back to the house, Qin Ruoying walked to Qianxi's side, gently held his hand, and asked worriedly, "What's wrong?" Qianxi did not speak, but pulled her directly to the main hall. In the main hall, Qin Yongyan had been waiting for a long time. After Qin Xueqing also arrived, Qianxi looked at the Heavenly Gate mountain again, and then asked in a deep voice, "What is the Heavenly Gate?" Hearing this, Qin Yongyan's eyelids suddenly twitched, and his expression became more serious. Qin Ring and Qin Xueqing looked at each other, and their faces were full of doubts. Heavenly Gate, Xian knew Qin had never cared before. He returned from the Tianyuan world, and returned to an environment with sparse spiritual energy like Earth. Even if all the masters in the world were gathered in front of him, a dignified soul formation cultivator, coming to such a degenerate planet, it would only be a matter of one move. It was like putting an MMA fighter in a nursing home or kindergarten. He could easily punch the Nanshan nursing home and kick the Beihai kindergarten. Therefore, Qianxi had never cared about the inheritance on Earth. But now, he found that he was wrong. He was ridiculously wrong. Qin Yongyan and Yan Yan could cultivate. Qin Ring and Qin Xueqing couldn't cultivate. Qin Xueqing was even a martial Dao master of the same realm as Qin Yongyan. But why couldn't Qin Xueqing sense qi? Qianxi didn't think in this direction before, because he had lived for more than 500 years, and he had never heard of anyone who couldn't even sense qi. There were many cultivators who couldn't break through the qi refinement stage, and that was because their aptitude was too low. But if they couldn't even sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, wouldn't they be worse than those unintelligent wild beasts? This was obviously not a problem of aptitude. Qin Ring and Qin Xueqing were only cousins, not biological sisters. So there was only one thing left in common between them, and that was their identity as Xian Nu. That mysterious heavenly gate could actually make people unable to sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Qianxi felt a little scared when he thought about it. So the most important thing now was to figure out what the so-called heavenly gate was. After Qianxi asked this question, the main hall suddenly fell into silence. After a long time, Qin Yongyan looked at Qianxi and sighed. The heavenly gate is an ancient legend. According to records, it hasn't appeared for more than 100 years. It hasn't appeared for more than 100 years? Then what exactly is it? The old people in the village said that the heavenly gate is the southern heavenly gate of the heavenly court. When the heavenly gate is opened, mortals can ascend and become immortals. What a joke! Hearing this, Qianxi couldn't help but angrily scold. It's the 21st century, and there are satellites everywhere in the sky. People in the United States have even climbed to the moon. Why is this lousy village still practicing feudal superstition? It wasn't that Qianxi looked down on Earth, but it was the truth. In terms of the cultivation environment on Earth, Grand Uncle's pseudo-core state was probably the peak of the world. He hadn't even completely condensed his Jindan, let alone Yuaning. How could he want to ascend and become an immortal? This might be the biggest joke Qianxi had heard in more than 500 years. However, after hearing Qianxi's scolding, Qin Yongyan shook his head disapprovingly, but he didn't immediately reply. Qianxi was stunned for a moment and immediately realized that he had lost his composure. He didn't know what had happened to him recently. His hostility was getting stronger and stronger, and he was becoming more and more irritable. If there was something that didn't go his way, he would lose his composure. This situation seemed to have started after he came to Shangjing. Thinking of this, Qianxi couldn't help but take a deep breath. After adjusting his emotions, he looked at Qin Yongyan again. After seeing that he had calmed down a lot, Qin Yongyan replied seriously, "That's not a joke. It's true." Qianxi was stunned. He was really confused. Could it be that the cultivators on Earth thought that a Jindan was an immortal emperor? Not to mention what kind of realm an immortal emperor was. In terms of lifespan, an immortal emperor was said to be immortal as long as heaven and earth. How many years did a Jindan cultivator have? A mere 500 years. In the eyes of cultivators, 500 years was just a blink of an eye. It was nothing at all. Forget it, there might be a cognitive gap between him and Qin Yongyan. Chapter 124. What's a Xiannu? Qin Xueqing couldn't help but roll her eyes when she heard this question, because she had already told Xianxia many times. Since her sister-in-law didn't want to answer, Qin Ruoying immediately explained, Xiannu is the witch who presides over the Elysium sacrificial ceremony. The sacrificial ceremony is held once a year, similar to the ancestral worship during the New Year. What are the conditions? What are the requirements to become a Xiannu? There are no special requirements. You have to be under the age of 10 and automatically step down when you reach the age of 30. No requirements? As long as you're of the right age? Xianxia pondered for a moment. Then, as if he had thought of something, he quickly asked, What happens after you're chosen? Do you have to go through any ceremony before you become a Xiannu? Ceremony? Qin Ruoying thought for a moment, then said with some uncertainty, I can't remember clearly. I remember that on the day we became Xiannu, we entered the ancestral hall. After entering, the clan elder asked us to make a wish. He said that every Xiannu can make a wish, yes. Qin Xueqing also seemed to have thought of something at this time, and immediately echoed, I remember that my wish at that time was to become a martial Dao master. And then? Qin Xueqing was a little distressed. After thinking for a long time, she muttered, and then I forgot. Hearing this, Xianxia couldn't help but become serious. There was a problem. When they became Xiannu, Qin Ruoying was 8 years old, and Qin Xueqing was 6 years old. Children at this age should be able to clearly remember some of the more important things. How could she forget such a big thing as becoming the Empyrean maiden? Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but turn his head to look at Qin Yongyan. Qin Yongyan seemed to know what he wanted to ask, so he directly answered, Xiannu make wishes in the ancestral hall. I can't go in, so I don't know what ceremony to hold before becoming a Xiannu. She frowned slightly. After hesitating for a moment, he then turned his head to Qin Ruoying and said very seriously, Ying, look at me and then do as I say. Okay. Qin Ruoying was a little confused, but out of her trust in Xianxia, she immediately nodded. Then, at Xianxia's request, she turned around and looked straight into Xianxia's eyes. Relax, take a deep breath, spit it out. Very good, Ying, look into my eyes. The soul-searching technique has certain side effects. Even if it is minimal, Xianxia can't use it on Qin Ruoying. Although he can't search her soul, he can try to hypnotize Qin Ruoying, and then use hypnosis to dig out the memories buried in her subconscious. Xianxia has never learned hypnosis, but he has seen the illusion of the Tianxian world, which is more advanced than hypnosis. Qin Ruoying is the person in the world who trusts him the most besides Nianyan, so in less than 2 minutes, Xianxia has successfully hypnotized her. Ying, think about it. When you were 8 years old, you became a Xiannu, walked into the ancestral hall, made a wish, and then, what else did you do? The human consciousness has 2 basic functions, executive and supervisory. The executive function allows us to control and regulate our own behavior, and the supervisory function allows us to observe our own behavior. Under normal circumstances, these 2 functions of the consciousness are connected, but hypnosis can sever the connection between the 2 functions. Under hypnosis, the hypnotized person will enter a special state of consciousness. Their executive function will be normal and they will be able to accept the hypnotist's orders, but the supervisory function will be lost. When the supervisory function is lost, the brain will enter a subconscious state, and from there, dig out some forgotten things. Qin Ruoying looked at Xianxia with empty eyes. After hearing Xianxia's question, the expression on her face immediately showed some pain. After thinking for a long time, Qin Ruoying murmured, After making the wish, I saw a door. The door was talking to me. It called me over. Qin Ruoying's words were too vague, and Xianxia didn't understand. But his intuition told him that this is a very important part. The light disappeared, drank the soul-restoring soup, became a Xiannu. Soul-restoring soup? Soul? Xianxia was shocked. and then he stood up from the chair with an ashen face. He quickly formed a hand seal, and then gently pressed his right hand on Qin Ruing's head. Humans have 3 spiritual souls and 7 physical souls. After a person dies, the 7 physical souls will disperse, and then the heaven soul will ascend to heaven, the earth soul will enter the earth, and the life soul will enter the cycle of reincarnation. The heaven soul is yang, the earth soul is yin, and the life soul is yang. Therefore, the earth soul is also called the yin soul. Chen Shi's soul was damaged, so even though he was with Qin Ruing every day, he didn't realize it. Qin Ruing's soul was damaged. The 7 physical souls are all there, but one of the 3 spiritual souls is missing. She lost her earth soul, so no wonder she couldn't find Qi. One of the 3 spiritual souls is missing, so she can't be considered a complete person. How can she embark on the orthodox path of immortality? At this thought, Chen Shi immediately went to Qin Xueqing's side. He didn't say anything and directly placed his hand on Qin Xueqing's head. Qin Xueqing was stunned. Before she could react, Chen Shi had already retracted his hand and stood beside Qin Ruing. He lightly brushed his hand across Qin Ruing's face and then couldn't help but murmur, "No wonder you guys can't find Qi no matter what." So the price to become Xian Nu is to give up the earth soul. To mortals, missing one of the 3 spiritual souls was not a fatal problem. Missing 1 spiritual soul meant that the body was weak and sickly. Missing 2 spiritual souls meant that the body was in a coma. Missing 3 spiritual souls meant that the 7 physical souls would disperse, and the person would die. The so-called soul recovery soup was probably a prescription to allow Xian Nu to live like a normal person. Without the earth soul, Xian Nu would never be able to become a necromancer. Even if she practiced martial arts, she would never be able to break through to the controlled Dan realm. As for cultivating, it was even more impossible. Chen Shi woke Qin Ruing up. When she woke up, she immediately held her head, as if she had a headache. Seeing this, Chen Shi gently rubbed her acupoints. When she finally felt better, Chen Shi said softly, "Ying, I have to go to the village again." Qin Ruing was a little confused and didn't know what had happened. When she heard that Chen Shi was going to the village, she immediately asked nervously, "Go to the village?" "It's nothing. Just rest well. Take good care of Nian. Don't let her know that I'm gone. Don't worry, I'll definitely be back before the afternoon." Seeing Chen Shi's serious expression, Qin Ruing could only nod and agree. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something. But at this time, Chen Shi had already turned and walked out of the main hall. Qin Ruing hurriedly got up and chased after him. But when she walked out of the main hall, Chen Shi had already soared into the sky, disappearing from her sight in the blink of an eye. Qin Ruing stood outside the main hall, looking at the slightly gloomy sky. After a long time, she lowered her head and looked at the limestone fragments in the courtyard. A trace of worry flashed across her face. Why did he go? Chapter 125. Winter in the Qinling Mountains was very dark. It was clearly noon, but the visibility in the mountains was never more than 200 or 300 meters. The fog was thick and the snow was white. This small village hidden in the valley was as quiet and peaceful as ever. Outside the solemn ancestral hall, the huge bronze cauldron had been carefully cleaned. The accumulated snow on top of the cauldron had also been cleared away, revealing the thick and dignified aura of a bronze artifact that had been buried in snow for a long time. The originally empty square was now filled with countless ritual tools and props. Great-granduncle's body was nowhere to be found. According to the tradition of the village, after setting up a cenotaph for him, he still needed to be held in the square outside the ancestral hall for 7 days and 7 days before the burial ceremony could be held. The main character of this funeral was only great-granduncle. Third uncle was on the verge of death, but he was lucky enough to survive. Third uncle would probably secretly rejoice when he woke up. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan hid in the house and drank to drown their sorrows. The sweet and bitter taste entered their throats, but the two of them wanted to get drunk. However, their cultivation was so high that even getting drunk had become an extravagant hope. Although several days had passed, the appearance of that young man seemed to be becoming clearer in their minds. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan were the same age, and 2 years older than Qin Yongyan. The village was not a sect, nor was it a family clan. This was an ordinary village with a few hundred families living in it. Of course, this village had its own special characteristics. The 100 schools of Qi men and the 6 paths of miscellaneous studies. Each family might have a different inheritance. Zhao Xinghuai, Li Hoan, and Qin Yongyan all learned martial arts, so they had been very playful since they were young. As the backbone of the village, Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan had always had their own pride. Third uncle was their role model. Great-granduncle was their dream. But now, everything had been shattered. Until that day they finally understood what was power. That was absolute power, and also a power that made people despair. Everyone was frightened. Even though the great-granduncle, who was the most senior, the strongest, and the most respected person in the village, died on the spot, no one dared to stand out and say that they would avenge him. The elders were silent. After great-granduncle died, the 7 elders didn't even dare to show their faces. They just let that man swagger away. Old Qin was incredible. She gave birth to a good daughter, and her daughter found a good son-in-law. Who would have thought that after competing with Qin Yongyan for most of their lives, they would lose in this aspect? The more Zhao Xinghuai thought about it, the more frustrated he felt. He picked up the earthen jug and drank from it. Li Hoan was stunned for a moment, then he raised the earthen jar and clinked it with him. It was still snowing outside. After drinking this jar of wine, they had to go out and clear the snow to prevent the bronze cauldrons and magic tools in the square from being buried by the snow. After all, it was the great-granduncle's sacrificial offering. They couldn't be too shabby. Both of them were grandmasters of the dance stage, so after drinking, they casually put on a thin layer of clothing and walked out of the door. Then they took a broom and swept the snow on the ground. It was obviously noon, but because the fog blocked the sun, the whole sky looked very gloomy, as dreary as before a rainstorm. The gloomy weather made people feel even more gloomy. Bah, this damn weather! Zhao Xinghuai cursed bitterly as he swept the snow with a broom. Suddenly, he seemed to feel something, so he quickly looked up at the sky. He saw that in the foggy sky, there suddenly appeared a faintly discernible black spot. The black spot was getting bigger and bigger. Zhao Xinghuai couldn't help but straighten his body, looking up to see it more clearly. Old Li, look! Their eyesight was far better than ordinary people, so Li Hoan immediately found that very small black spot. It seemed to be a person? In just a breath's time, that black shadow had already flown directly above their heads. At this time, the two finally saw the figure clearly. It was him. Even if this young man turned into ashes, he would be able to recognize him at a glance. Zhao Xinghuai was shocked. Almost without thinking, he raised the broom and put on a defensive posture. However, the young man flying in the sky didn't seem to see them at all. They didn't see him do anything, but a long sword suddenly appeared in his hand. Oh no! As soon as he saw the sword, Zhao Xinghuai panicked. But before he shouted, he saw the young man gently slashing the sword at the ancestral hall below. A sword gleam with golden light shot out. As the sword gleam flew toward the ancestral hall, it slowly became bigger. At first, it looked like an ordinary long sword. In the blink of an eye, it had become dozens of times bigger. When it was about to reach the ancestral hall, the sword gleam seemed to have become a high-speed train, directly hitting the middle of the ancestral hall's door. Boom! The ancestral hall's door exploded with a loud bang, immediately setting off thousands of violent turbulence. The wooden door was swept by the violent turbulence, instantly smashed into countless pieces. However, it wasn't over yet. After hitting the ancestral hall's door, the sword gleam didn't stop. Like a train that didn't stop, the sword gleam passed through the front yard, crushed the main hall, and only stopped when it hit the hillside behind the ancestral hall. This young man's casual swing of the sword actually cut the ancestral hall in half. The sword gleam disappeared. The violent turbulence that it set off became even more violent. Zhao Xinghuai stood in the square, holding his dantian and crossing his arms in front of him. The violent flying sand and gravel kept hitting his body, causing his skin and flesh to hurt. If he continued to resist like this, he might suffer unnecessary injuries. So Zhao Xinghuai thought for a while, and had no choice but to put down his pride as a grandmaster. He suddenly lay on the ground, then covered his head with both hands, and prayed that the storm would soon subside. After a long time, the turbulence finally calmed down, and the smoke and dust dissipated. The solemn ancestral hall had been split into two, as if the middle part had been forcefully removed. It was a scene of broken walls and ruins. Zhao Xinghuai lay on the ground. After feeling that the storm had subsided, he secretly raised his head to look at the situation. Li Hoan lay not far away from him. The open space around the square was full of broken wood and gravel, and the ancestral hall was also split in half. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his head to look at the sky. That young man, holding a long sword, he looked like a god descending from the heavens, looking down on all living beings with an expressionless face. He gently landed not far in front of Zhao Xinghuai. Then his voice slowly reached Zhao Xinghuai's ears. "I don't want to kill for no reason, so I want to ask you to tell me, Xianxu's ghost, where is it?" These words were not directed at Zhao Xinghuai alone. His voice was very soft, but it rang in every corner of the village at the same time. The tranquility of the village was broken. Countless people came out of their rooms and rushed toward the square. Looking from the sky, it was like a piece of white paper suddenly appeared with many ants. The crowd was crowded, but no one dared to approach the square. Chen Shi held a long sword, silently looking at the ancestral hall in front of him. Suddenly, a group of old men came out from the ruins of the ancestral hall. There were a total of 7 of them, all wearing white training clothes, and they were of different sizes. The leader was holding the dragon-headed walking stick of great-granduncle that day. He probably took over great-granduncle's position after his death. The 7 old men stood on the steps, looking at Chen Shi from afar. After hesitating for a moment, the leader of the old men sighed softly, "You are already a heavenly being at such a young age, why do you have to force us old bones?" Hearing this, Chen Shi could not help but sneer, "Hand over the Xianin soul, and I promise not to hurt anyone." As his voice fell, the leader of the old men fell silent. The few old men beside him could not help but have a slight change in expression. Immediately after, they silently communicated with their eyes. This ancient village hid many secrets. For example, Xianxu's ghost was actually the key to opening the Divine Gate. The Divine Gate had not appeared for more than 100 years, and Xianxu had been replaced by batches. It was not until this batch that they finally received a heavenly warning, confirming that the Divine Gate was about to open. This was also their last chance. Several old men looked at Chen Shi at the bottom of the steps, silently communicating. Chapter 126. The wind and snow continued. The elders did not speak. They were communicating with their eyes. Perhaps it was their unique tacit understanding. Chen Shi did not understand, nor did he bother to guess. He stood in the square with his sword in hand, quietly waiting for their reply. More and more people gathered around, but no one dared to approach the square. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan had already retreated to the small house where they were drinking. The cold wind whistled past, and the square was a scene of desolation. After about 2 minutes, the elder with the dragon-headed cane finally turned his head and glanced at Chen Shi. But then he shifted his gaze away. The expression on his face was very complicated, as if he was still struggling with something. In fact, on the day when Chen Shi took away Qin Ruoying, they had already discussed it. At that time, they chose to compromise. But what they did not expect was that Chen Shi would actually come back and want to take back Xianxu's ghost. Everyone handed the right to make the decision to him, which put a lot of pressure on him. After looking at the elders again, seeing that they all nodded at him, the elder frowned and finally made the final decision. "We agree to your request." Hearing this, Chen Shi could not help but nod, very satisfied with his answer. The elder slowly walked down the stairs with the dragon-headed cane, then went straight to the giant bronze cauldron. "The ghosts of Xianxu have been sealed in this giant cauldron for generations. I will now release them." After explaining to Chen Shi, The elder suddenly jumped up and inserted the dragon-headed cane in his hand into the giant bronze cauldron. The sound of metal colliding was suddenly heard. Immediately after, a golden light suddenly emerged from the giant bronze cauldron. The golden light was as small as the light from a laser pointer at first. But in the blink of an eye, the light had become as thick as a bucket. The golden light burst into the sky. A crack was instantly torn in the gloomy sky. The clouds in the sky churned. As if affected by something, with the golden light as the center, a huge cloud vortex gradually condensed in the clouds. What was even stranger was that the cloud vortex was rotating at a speed visible to the naked eye. The old man standing beside the giant cauldron became excited when he saw the scene in front of him. Suddenly, a faint fluorescent golden barrier appeared above the village, instantly enveloping the entire valley. Then, a strong vibration came from the ground, as if there was an earthquake. Immediately afterward, a golden light pillar as thick as a bucket rose from the four corners of the valley. These 5 pillars of light seemed to be the pillars of the barrier. When the light pillars rose from the 4 corners, the barrier in the sky became even more dazzling. The barrier was like a golden tortoise shell, encircling the valley where the village was located. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly stopped. The sun broke through the clouds. Almost instantly, everyone felt their eyes light up, and their vision widened a lot. Formation array? Seeing this, Xianxia couldn't help but frown. He still remembered that there was a stone tablet at the entrance of the village, with the word Fangxi written on it. So he turned his head to look at the entrance of the village, only to find that the stone tablet was located at the place where the light pillar rose. He originally thought that this village only had a simple concealment formation, but after it was activated, Xianxia found that this formation array was no small matter. There were only a few functions of the formation array: trapping, killing, illusory, and some non-offensive auxiliary formations, such as breath concealment and spirit gathering. This formation array was arranged according to the terrain of the dragon vein, and could be said to be very expensive. After the 5 light pillars rose, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the entire formation suddenly swept over like a tide, wave after wave. Xianxia hadn't felt this surging spiritual energy of heaven and earth for a long time. But it was a little strange. With the conditions of the earth, even if it was a spirit-seizing formation set up by a Dongshu stage cultivator, it was impossible to set off such a strong spiritual energy tide in such a short time. Xianxia thought for a while. Then he suddenly understood. The formation in front of him was not a spirit-seizing formation, but a composite formation with both spirit gathering and spirit binding functions at the same time. The formation used the valley as the base, the 4 stone tablets in the 4 directions as the formation door, the giant bronze cauldron in the center of the square as the formation eye, and the valley terrain as the formation pattern. After the formation was set up, it would continuously seize the spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the Qinling Mountains, and then bind the spiritual energy within the formation. To seize such a large amount of spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the earth, this formation array was set up at least 500 years ago. The spirit binding formation was a one-time use formation. After it was activated, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth accumulated over the years would burst out at once. In the heavenly jade world, cultivators above the golden core stage would usually set up a spirit binding formation in their cave abodes, in case of emergency. This was like rain from the sky. So, Xianxia hurriedly sat cross-legged on the ground, taking advantage of the surging spiritual energy tide, and began to cultivate crazily. The opportunity couldn't be missed, so Xianxia didn't want to investigate why the old man suddenly activated this one-time auxiliary formation array. However, not long after he sat down cross-legged, the 4 light pillars in the north, south, east, and west suddenly turned into rainbows, like a rainbow bridge, and suddenly connected with the main light pillar above the giant bronze cauldron. The 5 light pillars suddenly gathered together, and the main light pillar immediately became very thick. Just by looking at its diameter, it was almost the same as the giant bronze cauldron. At this moment, the old man standing below the giant cauldron's face suddenly changed, and a burst of ecstasy appeared on his face. Then he suddenly knelt on the ground and shouted respectfully, "Welcome, Divine General." Before he finished speaking, a figure walked out of the light pillar. It was a burly man who was almost 2 meters tall. His upper body was bare, revealing his strong muscles. The man called Divine General was floating in midair. After slowly scanning the surroundings, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Heaven's opening line, you only have the time of an incense stick. Speak." The old man knelt on the ground and looked up at the Divine General in the sky very sincerely. It seemed that he was so excited that his lips moved for a long time, but he didn't say a word. The elder ancestor's words were true. At this moment, Xianxia suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at the man flying in the sky, then looked at the old man kneeling on the ground. Then, Xianxia's lips suddenly curled into a faint sneer. "I thought you were really going to return Xian Yu's spirit to me. I didn't expect that you just wanted to ask for help. Forget it, since you don't want to give it to me, I'll find it myself." As he said that, he slowly stood up from the ground. After hearing Xianxia's words, the Divine General lowered his head and noticed him. One was in the sky. One was on the ground. Chapter 127. The spirit-binding array that had existed for hundreds of years was suddenly activated. Wave after wave of heaven and earth spirit chi surged, giving Xianxia an illusion. It was as if he had returned to the Tianxian domain. The surging heaven and earth spirit chi created an extremely comfortable environment for him, so comfortable that all the pores on his body could not help but open up naturally. He really needed the nourishment of heaven and earth spirit chi. Now, every breath he took was a great pleasure for Xianxia. The spirit chi surged, and the golden light soared into the sky. When the so-called Divine General walked out of the pillar of light, Xianxia finally understood the meaning of the existence of this array. This spirit-binding array was actually the last trump card of the village. The Divine General of the Elysium. The accumulation of hundreds of years of the array was only in exchange for the time it took for the Divine General to appear. When Xianxia killed great-granduncle and took Qin Ruing away, they did not activate the array. Now that he came back to ask for the ghost, these old guys finally chose to activate the array and tried to fight to the death with Xianxia. It could be seen that Xian Yu's ghost was more important to them than their own lives. Xianxia looked up at the burly man flying in the sky. A long sword of frost suddenly appeared in his hand. The old guys at least had the chance to struggle and hesitate, but he did not. Because he was faced with only one choice. Take back Yingying's ghost. Otherwise, when Qin Ruing gradually grew old in his arms, Xianxia would also fall into endless pain and regret. He could not accept the arrival of that day. Therefore, then let's fight. If they were not willing to give, then let's fight. Xianxia was determined to kill, and the long sword of frost immediately glowed faintly. Then, under the slightly surprised gaze of the Divine General, he suddenly waved the long sword in his hand. The tip of the sword went from bottom to top, drawing an arc in the air. A sword radiance suddenly flew out. Seeing that Xianxia dared to suddenly attack him, the Divine General's eyes flashed with surprise. The sword radiance came menacingly, and in an instant, it was in front of him. He did not seem to move, but a ball of blazing flames suddenly sprang up around the Divine General. A barrier of stellar energy that seemed to be made of flames instantly formed. Bang! The sword radiance slammed into the flame barrier, like a typhoon erupting, and a storm of chi soared into the sky. But right after that, the flame barrier suddenly expanded. Then, a huge fireball with a diameter of more than 10 meters appeared in the air. Interesting. Accompanied by a burst of laughter, the Divine General's figure suddenly flew out of the fireball. He suddenly stretched out his right hand and formed a claw with his 5 fingers. He clawed at the air and a golden fireball appeared in his palm. After the golden fireball appeared, the Divine General's body seemed to be on fire. Golden flames kept jumping around him. Like the sun rising from the east, the golden fireball instantly ignited all the air within a radius of dozens of meters. The sun hung in the sky, the fire burning the sky. Xianxia stared intently at the tall and sturdy man in the sky, a trace of excitement rising in her heart. This move made him feel a hint of danger. The divine general seemed to be holding the sun in his hand, his body burning with raging flames. Like a meteor falling from the sky, he cut across the sky and smashed viciously toward Xianxia, who was standing on the ground. At this critical moment, Xianxia swung the sword in his hand, and in an instant, tens of thousands of sword radiances appeared. Countless long swords made of frost and snow appeared around him. They floated in the air, quietly waiting for orders. Xianxia pointed his sword to the sky, and the floating swords immediately turned their tips and aimed at the fireball in the sky. The third move of the moonlight sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to the sect. The densely packed long swords of frost and snow instantly converged into a long river of sword radiances, like the Milky Way flowing in reverse, and collided with the fireball in midair. The entire sky was instantly divided into two worlds. On one side of the divine general of the stellar of time, flames and snakes of fire danced in the sky. It was as if one was above the sun, the crown flow feathers shining brightly. On the other side of Xianxia, wind and clouds surged, snow and ice splattered everywhere, as if one was caught in the most violent snowstorm of the North Pole. The two of them seemed to be separated by an invisible and boundless glass wall. In one world, there were two kinds of wonders. It was truly amazing. Boom! The moment the sword radiances met the fireball, it was as if a nuclear bomb had exploded. A strong shockwave suddenly erupted, and the old man closest to them was immediately sent flying by the violent strength chi. Such a violent shockwave instantly turned all the houses around the square into ruins. Fortunately, most of the people in the village were not ordinary people, and those who dared to come close to watch the battle were experts of a certain level of strength. But even so, the aftermath of the battle still caused them serious internal injuries. It was too terrifying. Just the aftermath of the battle between the two of them could cause such a huge amount of damage. Was he still human? Zhao Xinghuai lay on the ground, trembling. Suddenly, he came to his senses and quickly stood up, clutching his chest in pain. Then he pulled Li Hoan up, turned around, and shouted to the crowd behind him, "Everyone run! Leave the village! The farther the better!" The crowd of onlookers fled in all directions. A battle of this level was no longer something they could watch. On the square, the shock wave caused by the battle between the two of them finally subsided. The square, which was originally the size of 2 basketball courts, seemed to have been hit by a huge invisible iron ball. With Xianxia as the center, a huge circular crater appeared on the ground of the square. The deepest part of the crater was at least 5 meters deep. Xianxia floated in the middle of the crater, facing the divine general of the stellar of time in the sky. After this collision, they had more or less figured out each other's strength, so they did not intend to attack immediately. The divine general looked at Xianxia thoughtfully, then suddenly laughed. "Your cultivation is not very high, but the move you used just now was really powerful." From the looks of it, he seemed to be very interested in the sword art that Xianxia had just used. "Is that so?" Xianxia raised her eyelids and looked at the tall and sturdy man. She couldn't help but sneer. The divine general in front of him was not an immortal cultivator, but after exchanging blows with him, Xianxia could roughly estimate his strength. Above Yuanying and below soul formation. What about himself? In fact, he was now like a sorcerer without mana. He still had his realm, but his accumulation of vital energy was far from enough. When the array was activated just now, Xianxia took the opportunity to absorb a wave of spiritual energy from heaven and earth, which allowed him to successfully use the third move of the moonlight sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to origin. Xianxia floated above the crater, holding the long sword silently, as if he was thinking about something. The divine general did not seem to be in a hurry, because the person in front of him had indeed piqued his interest. After a while. Chapter 128. Wasting time? He was probably stalling for time. After hearing the elder's words, the immortal general lowered his head and looked at Xianxia with a faint smile. He thought for a moment and suddenly spread his hands. Following that, 2 golden fireballs leaped up from his palms. I'm very interested in the sword technique you used just now. If you give it to me, I promise I won't attack again. He was very interested in Xianxia's sword technique. The expressions of the few old men who were hiding nearby changed drastically when they heard his words. If the Immortal General didn't attack, then after he left, that young man would probably massacre the entire village. If they had known this would happen, they would have just returned the In's soul to him. Xianxia held his sword and floated above the giant pit. He lowered his head and didn't say a word. No one knew what he was thinking. After hearing the Immortal General's words, Xianxia looked up at him. It seemed that he didn't like the feeling of looking up at others. So Xianxia flew up until he reached the same height as the Immortal General. Then, he said calmly, "You want my sword technique? You have good taste." The moonlight sword technique was comparable to the 49 forms of heaven's divination. There were only 3 forms, but the power of these 3 forms would increase as the user's realm increased. Gold will always shine. Your cultivation isn't high enough, so you won't be able to use the true power of this sword technique. Why don't you give it to me? What do you think? The Immortal General smiled. As he spoke, he looked at the 2 golden fireballs in his palms. The golden fireballs kept jumping, as if they were silently threatening him. I might not be able to kill you in 30 minutes, but I don't think it'll be a big problem if I want to seriously injure you. The Immortal General was very confident, as if he had Xianxia under control. Hearing this, Xianxia couldn't help but laugh. This sword technique is called the Moonlight Sword Technique. It's of the Yin attribute. It might conflict with your fire attribute technique. That's not important. No one will complain about having too many techniques. The Immortal General said indifferently. However, Xianxia's next words stunned him. I have a set of saber techniques that are comparable to a sword technique. It's of the Yang attribute. I think it'll be compatible with your technique. As soon as he finished speaking, Xianxia gently raised his left hand. Then, a gust of wind suddenly blew in the deep pit below him. A small tornado suddenly rose from the bottom of the pit. Then, it wrapped the dust and gravel on the ground and flew directly toward Xianxia's left hand. In the blink of an eye, a long saber made of dust suddenly appeared in his hand. After the dust blade was formed, it immediately formed a sharp contrast with the frost sword in his right hand. The saber was yellow, but the sword was clear and bright. Dust was the knife, frost and snow were the sword. He wanted to kill everyone in the world. The Immortal General was stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed wildly. Saber and sword mastery? Interesting. Then let me see if your saber is worthy of your sword. With that, the Divine General clasped his hands together. The 2 sun-like blazing fireballs immediately merged into one, erupting with a powerful shockwave. An incomparably dazzling golden light suddenly exploded from his palm, illuminating the entire sky in a deathly white. The extreme of Yang fire, burning the sky and boiling the sea. While the Immortal General was practicing, Xianxia was not idle. The frost sword in his right hand suddenly glowed with a faint cold light, and the dust blade in his left hand shone with a little yellow light. Moonlight Sword Technique, Red Sun Saber Technique. The saber and the sword merged. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. As soon as this move was made, the world suddenly changed color. There seemed to be a wave of saber and sword behind Xianxia. The invisible wind and visible clouds in the sky strangely disappeared at the moment when the saber and sword came out together. The saber and sword were annihilated, and the wind and clouds changed color. With Xianxia as the center, there seemed to be a vacuum zone within 100 feet. All the wind, clouds, dust, and even the spiritual qi of heaven and earth were expelled from the battlefield by him. Then, he slashed the saber and sword in his hand toward the Immortal General. In the courtyard, after watching an episode of cartoons, the little fellow sat on the bed and shouted, "Papa? Papa? I want to pee." She was very clingy. She knew how to go to the bathroom by herself, but she just didn't want to go alone. The little fellow shouted for a while. Her father, who used to respond to her calls, didn't come today. She pouted and was obviously a little unhappy, so she immediately lay on the bed and rolled. Papa! 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 Where did you go? After all, Qin Ruoying was just immortal, so she didn't have the 5 senses as sharp as Xianxi's. She was still standing in the yard in a daze. Although Xianxia could even kill great-granduncle with one sword, Qin Ruoying had a faint, unjustified worry after he left this time. She hadn't seen Xianxia for 5 years, and she was really afraid to be separated from him again. Papa was not here, and Mama didn't hear it. When the big cat saw that the little one was making a scene, it immediately jumped out of the bed and ran to Qin Ruoying's side. Then, it rubbed its body against her feet. Meow! The big cat called Qin Ruoying back from her chaotic thoughts. As soon as she saw the big cat, she knew that something must have happened to Nian, so she ran to the west wing. Sure enough, before she stepped into the room, she had already heard the little fellow shouting for Papa. Children were always clingy, so sometimes when their mother was not around, they would start to look for their mother inexplicably when they went to the bathroom or went out to throw away the garbage. Once their mother didn't appear in time, then sorry, if it was light, they would be easily angry, and if it was heavy, they would cry, and it was very difficult to coax them. Qin Ruoying still spent too little time with the little fellow, so once the little fellow had anything, the first reaction was to look for her father, not her mother. She quickly sat beside the little fellow, gently helped her up, and then asked worriedly, Nian, what's wrong? I want to pee. The little fellow pouted and said very discontentedly. Then Mama will take you, okay? As she said, Qin Ruoying reached out to pick up the little fellow. However, the little fellow pushed her away. No, I want Papa. I want Papa. As she said, the little fellow suddenly pouted and cried. I want Papa. The more she said, the more upset she became, and bean-sized tears suddenly fell from the corners of her eyes. Qin Ruoying was a little at a loss, and could only softly comfort her. Papa went out to buy something and will be back soon. If you want to pee, Mama will go with you, okay? I want Papa. The little fellow sat on the bed, her little hands kept patting the bed, and her 2 legs kicked the bed at random. Looking at her like this, she was on the verge of exploding. Seeing her like this, Qin Ruoying suddenly looked a little embarrassed. After hesitating for a moment, she tentatively reached out her hand again. The little fellow did not refuse, and Qin Ruoying finally took her in her arms. Nian, Papa went out to buy something and he will be back soon. Nian, don't cry. Mama will be with you, okay? No. Papa said that he will never leave me. I want Papa. I want Papa. Hearing this, Qin Ruoying trembled all over, and could not help but cry. At this moment, she suddenly remembered the time when Nian was just born. At that time, the little fellow was still a cute baby. As long as she was not held for a while, she would cry loudly. Whenever little Nian cried, Qin Ruoying would hold her in her arms in a panic. Shaking and shaking, it would take a long time for little Nian to stop crying and giggle. So what she was most afraid of at that time was that the little fellow would cry, time flew, and the child had grown so big. Chapter 129. Qin Ruoying held the little girl in her arms. All of a sudden, she seemed to realize something. When she left Nian was still young, so she had no impression of her. Although she came back later, he had been with the little girl since he came back. With his meticulous care and love, she succeeded in occupying more and more weight in the little girl's heart. He had surpassed her mother and Aunt Zhang. Therefore, the little girl only needed her father now. Her father was her whole world. The intimacy between the father and daughter at any time made Qin Ruoying feel very lost. Father, mother, child. They were supposed to be a close family of 3. But because of the short separation before, there was a faint sense of alienation between them. The reason why Qin Ruoying felt alienated from Nian was that she hadn't realized how she should integrate into the family. Because of Nian's birth, the simple 2-person world between her and she had completely turned into a brand new 3-person world. As the father and mother, they had never appeared by the little girl's side at the same time. With the reunion of the family, when she showed great strength and confidence, Qin Ruoying was lost. It was a feeling that could make any woman lose herself. At the same time, it was also called a sense of security. Therefore, she felt extremely worried when Xianxia just left for a while. Just like Nian, she had to look for her father when she went to the toilet. Compared to her daughter, how much better was she? The mother and daughter were too dependent on Xianxia. He was the perfect husband and the perfect father. She, on the other hand, was just an unqualified mother. Thinking of this, Qin Ruing suddenly stopped crying. After wiping her eyes without leaving a trace, she let go of the little girl and carefully wiped her tears. Nian, don't cry. Daddy didn't leave you. He just went to buy groceries. He'll be back soon to cook for you. Don't you like Daddy's cooking the most? What do you want to eat tonight? I don't want to eat, I want Daddy. The little guy kicked the bed, still throwing a tantrum. Qin Ruing had no choice but to hug her gently and keep trying to reason with her. After a long while, after the little girl calmed down a little, Qin Ruing immediately picked her up and carried her to the bathroom. Let's go. Don't you want to pee? Mama will take you there. Be careful not to wet the bed again. Hearing this, the little guy was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He immediately pouted and shouted softly, I don't wet the bed. In the past life and in this life, the two looked at each other. The sword and the sword were used to cut off their worries. I walk alone in the heavens and under the earth. I am duty-bound and crazy for love. This set of sword and saber techniques didn't originate from the heavenly Yen divine sect. Instead, it was an ancient inheritance that Xianxia obtained by chance. The Dark Heaven Evil Emperor. The third form of the saber, the third form of the sword. The third form of sword and saber. 3 by 3 is inexhaustible, 9 by 9 returns to 1. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. Although it was a divine skill, it didn't change the fact that Xianxia's cultivation had been damaged. Xianxia, who was seriously injured, faced the divine general who was in his peak state. The divine general held the golden crow in his hand. It was like the sun had descended to earth. Thousands of golden pillars of fire swore to burn everything in the world to ashes. Xianxia's face was as calm as water. After the sword and saber slashed out, 2 huge shadows appeared in the sky. A saber and a sword instantly collided with the scorching fireball. When the saber and sword shadows collided with the raging flames in the sky, the entire world shook. The shockwave that shot out in all directions instantly dimmed the 5 golden pillars. The huge cloud vortex in the sky also trembled, almost being torn apart by the violent strength qi and vanishing into thin air. The spirit binding array was on the verge of collapse. A few elders hid behind the hill behind the ancestral hall. After the wind and smoke dissipated, they cautiously poked their heads out. The scene in front of them completely stunned them. Annihilation. Everything was annihilated. This village with a long history was instantly razed to the ground by such a violent collision. When the smoke and dust dissipated, a huge circular crater with a diameter of hundreds of meters appeared below the 2 of them. The land was originally flat, the houses were neat, and there were fertile fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees, and other plants. It was a paradise where chickens and dogs could hear each other. Now, it was completely gone. Even the small hill that they were hiding in had been cut in half. The divine general was still floating in the air. He wasn't wearing a shirt, revealing his strong muscles. The flames that kept rising around him like flames had already disappeared. Chi! There were no scars on his bronze-colored skin. But then, the divine general was like a broken showerhead. Tiny flowers of blood splattered all over his body. Not long after, his entire body was dyed red with blood. Xianxia held the saber in his left hand and the sword in his right, as if he had never moved. But if one looked closely, they would find that Xianxia was in a very strange state. His eyes were empty, as if he had lost his soul. The saber and sword were still in his hands, but there was a faint blood-red light around him. The confidence and wild laughter on the divine general's face had disappeared, leaving only fear. Yes, he was scared. Because his injuries were too serious, he couldn't even maintain flying. So, the divine general immediately made a wise decision. However, the moment he turned around. The blood-red light behind him lit up. The blood-red light that was as delicate and beautiful as fresh blood instantly dyed the entire sky red. The pillar of light that pierced through the clouds disappeared. The cloud vortex dissipated. The tortoise-shell-like golden barrier slowly turned into white smoke and disappeared. The wind and snow were still in the sky. The cold wind whistled through the sky with snowflakes. It was as if summer had turned to winter in an instant. A blood-red sword light suddenly slashed out. Bang! The hillside where the elders were hiding was immediately razed to the ground. Where is the soul of Xianxia? The cold and emotionless voice suddenly sounded in the sky. Hearing this, the leading old man immediately knelt on the ground and kowtowed heavily. Then, he tremblingly took out a black box and shouted, "The soul of the mysterious fairy is here. If I may be so bold, please spare our lives, immortal master." He knelt on the ground and held the box tightly with both hands, as if he was begging for mercy. This box was their only chance to live. If that man didn't agree, then they could only destroy this box. They would fight to the death. However, just as the old man was about to say something, a long sword of frost and snow suddenly formed in the sky above his head. Then, a blood-red sword light suddenly fell. Thud! The box fell to the ground and rolled a few times before lying down quietly in the mud. Xianxia casually waved his hand. The box seemed to have sensed something. After trembling slightly, it suddenly flew into his hand. After getting the box, Xianxia glanced around indifferently. The village had been reduced to nothing. The villagers had also retreated to the edge of the array. Everyone huddled together and trembled as they looked at the godlike man in the sky. He thought for a moment, then turned around and flew in the direction he came from. However, the moment he turned around and flew away, 6 blood-red sword lights suddenly appeared in the sky. Chapter 130. In the courtyard, Xianxia took the little fellow to the bathroom and wiped her face with a hot towel. The little fellow stopped crying at this time. She stood on the ground with her mouth pursed and her face full of grievance, but she looked very cute. Because she had just washed her face, the little fellow's little face was red. Like a ripe red apple, Xianxia could not help but reach out and gently pinch her pink little face. "I want to pee." As if to show her independence, the little fellow quickly ran to the side of the toilet and sat on it by herself. It was the first time Xianxia saw her daughter go to the bathroom, and she could not help but feel a little strange. However, she was worried that the little fellow would fall, so she quickly walked over and gently held her. After going to the bathroom, the little fellow did not want Xianxia to hold her and ran out without washing her hands. Xianxia quickly followed behind her and found that she wanted to open the door and go out. So she quickly stopped her and asked nervously, "Nian, where are you going?" She was afraid that the little fellow would run out to find her father. However, the little fellow did not seem to have that idea, but pouted and replied, "Papa said that after watching an episode of cartoons, we should go out and exercise. I want to exercise." Hearing this, Xianxia could only smile bitterly and open the door for her. This child, 3 sentences without leaving her father's side, did not consider her mother's feelings. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew in when the door opened. The little fellow shivered, but did not shrink back. Instead, she shouted loudly, "Big cat! Big cat! Let's go play in the yard!" Meow! The big cat lay at the foot of the bed, seemingly unwilling to move. Seeing this, the little fellow was immediately unhappy. She quickly ran to the side of the bed and pressed down on the big cat. Then, she took it into her arms and carried it out of the west wing. "Papa said that you have to play with me." Meow. Although the big cat was a monster, it still had the nature of an animal, so when winter came, it was lazy and did not want to move much. However, since the little fellow said so, it had to obediently accompany her. The inner courtyard had been completely destroyed by Xianxia, and there was a big hole in the middle. Xianxia was afraid that she would run into the hole and fall, so she quickly said, "Nian, just play on the steps." "What do you want to play?" "Mommy can play with you." The little fellow put the big cat, and seemed to think that there was no way to play in the yard, so she could not help but wrinkle her little face, as if she was thinking about what she should play. Seeing this, Qin Ruing immediately racked her brains to think of something. What to play? She had to say, as a mother's therefore, it was best to take this opportunity to cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Qin Ruing thought for a while, and then suddenly came up with a wonderful idea, so she immediately said to the little fellow, "Nian, mommy will play hide and seek with you, how about it?" Hide and seek? The little fellow was stunned for a moment, and then jumped up happily. She was so happy that she clapped her hands and shouted, "Okay! I want to play hide and seek." She had been yearning for hide and seek for a long time. It was just that she used to live in the Kangju district, and that house was too small, so she could not play. Aunt Zhang did not like her to run around in the district, so she had never allowed her to play hide and seek with other children. Therefore, when Qin Ring proposed this idea, the little fellow was immediately excited. The courtyard was so big and there were so many rooms. It was perfect for playing hide and seek. The mother and daughter quickly reached a consensus. Qin Ruing found, and the little fellow hid. After the discussion, Qin Ruing leaned against the wall and loudly chanted the 30-second countdown. Hearing her countdown, the little fellow, who was still giggling, immediately panicked. She looked around for a while, then suddenly jumped into the west wing, and then hurriedly hid in the closet. The west wing was the place she was most familiar with, so her first reaction was to go back to the room. This was the first time she played hide and seek, so she did not have much experience, so she made a lot of noise. After Qin Ruing finished counting down, she walked into the room with a faint smile. After looking around, she knew that the little fellow must have hidden in the closet. "Nian, where did you hide? Mommy can't find you." She pretended to wander around the room. The little fellow covered her mouth with both hands and nervously hid in the closet. She didn't even dare to breathe. Qin Ruing counted the time. About 2 minutes later, she approached the wardrobe as she spoke. Because she was afraid of scaring the little fellow, she paused outside the closet for a while, and then slowly opened the closet door. "Found you! Mommy, you're amazing!" Seeing Qin Ruing open the wardrobe door, the little girl didn't hide anymore. She immediately jumped into Qin Ruing's arms and giggled. "How is it? Is it fun?" "It's fun. I want to play more." "Well, I'll give you another chance. This time, you have to hide better, okay?" The little guy nodded his head heavily. Looking at her excited little face, she had probably long forgotten about her father. If you want to get along with children happily, you have to have 3 hearts: patience, love, and consideration. What's more, Nian was Qin Ruing's favorite. Therefore, after she adjusted her state of mind, she immediately played with the little fellow. With her mother's company, time passed quickly. When Qin Ruing found the little fellow for the 5th time, she finally came back. Like a gust of wind, he appeared in the courtyard without a sound. Qin Ruing followed the little fellow. As soon as she walked out of the room, she saw Xianxia. She froze for a moment. But the little fellow had already rushed to Xianxia, shouting, "Papa!" Xianxia was afraid that she would slip, so he quickly stepped forward and picked her up. "What's wrong? What are you playing?" "Hide and seek." "Mommy, play hide and seek with me." "Is it fun?" "It's fun." Qin Ruing looked at Xianxia in a daze. Xianxia was playing with the little fellow in his arms, as if there was nothing strange. What else did he want to hide? But could he hide it? Perhaps seeing the worry in Qin Ruing's eyes, Xianxia put the little fellow down with a smile, then touched her head and said with a smile, "Nian, it's cold outside. Go back to the room first." But seeing that her father was back, the little fellow was relieved, so she ran back to the room happily. After the little fellow left, Qin Ruing finally couldn't help but grab Xianxia's arm and ask anxiously, "Are you hurt? Where is the injury? Is it serious?" As she spoke, she looked up and down at Xianxia nervously. Xianxia had no trace of injury. However, his face was devoid of any color, and his lips were deathly pale. He looked like a patient who had lost too much blood. "I'm fine, don't worry." After feeling the warmth from his face, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but murmur, maybe it's because of Xian Nu's identity that I've basically fulfilled all the wishes I've made before. Just think of it as greed, so I have a new wish. Speaking of this, Qin Ruoying suddenly laughed, then turned to look at the room. At this time, the little girl's giggles sounded in the room. Silly child, watching cartoons alone can make you convulse with laughter. After the Earth Soul returned to its original position, Qin Shueqing really found the sense of qi. That kind of mysterious feeling made her, a martial arts fanatic, immediately intoxicated. Faintly, she even had an illusion. The long-sealed gate of the Alcade state seemed to finally show a sign of loosening. She could finally step into the Alcade state? Qin Wanqing was still struggling to break through to the Alcade realm. Qin Yongyan, on the other hand, started cultivating a few days earlier than her and took the spirit-gathering pill. Therefore, he smoothly stepped into the early stage of qi refinement and directly stepped into the Alcade realm. He was now a grandmaster of the Alcade state. This also made him more convinced that what Xianxia taught them was much more powerful than martial arts. His father-in-law and sister-in-law were both obsessed with cultivation, so they didn't even come out for dinner. Xianxia didn't want to interrupt this kind of state where they forgot to eat and sleep, so he left some food in the refrigerator for them. After dinner, Xianxia wanted Qin Ruoying to also cultivate. But at this time, Qin Ruoying shook her head and proposed to take a walk in Hohai. Take a walk? The little girl was lying on the bed. After hearing her mother's suggestion, she immediately raised her hands and feet, expressing her absolute approval. Being cooped up at home every day, this little girl was about to become moldy. In winter, the sun set early. It wasn't even 7 o'clock in the evening, but some places without street lights were already pitch black. Outside the big house, one could see the old street light at the entrance of Dongming Alley. The light of the street light was slightly yellow, elongating the shadows of the family of three. The little girl held Qin Ruoying's left hand and Xianxi's right hand. She squatted on the snow, and her two small cotton boots seemed to have turned into skis, constantly yelling for them to run. Just like the sleigh pulling the carriage at Christmas, her parents were the elk pulling the carriage. And she was Santa Claus bringing joy to the mortal world. Since their daughter had this request, her parents had to agree even if they had to work like cows or horses. Thus, Qin Ruoying and Xianxia looked at each other and smiled, and immediately pulled her to a trot. Giddy up! Horse run! Horse run! The sleigh started running, and the little girl's 2 feet immediately pulled a long track on the ground. She was so happy that she giggled, feeling that it seemed to be more interesting than riding a big cat. Qin Ruoying's physical fitness was average. In winter, she wore a lot of clothes and the snow was difficult to walk on, so after running for a while, she was tired and panting. And because she was so happy, she kept laughing. The intense exercise and the stimulation of the cold air immediately caused a sharp pain in her abdomen. Exercise-induced abdominal pain. Ouch! Qin Ruoying gasped for air as she clutched her stomach and groaned. Seeing this, Xianxia quickly stopped. Xianxia used his true essence to help her recuperate. After seeing that she was better, Xianxia said to the little girl, "Mommy's body isn't good. Nian, come, Daddy will play with you. Today, I'll let you experience what it means to be fast and furious." But after Qin Ruoying stopped, the little girl sat down on the ground. Hearing Xianxi's words, she immediately stretched out her hands and took Xianxi's right hand. "Little princess, let's go." After that, Xianxia started running. In this kind of snow, they couldn't run too fast. If the little girl couldn't control herself, she would be dragged to the ground by Xianxia. Therefore, Xianxia could only pay attention to the little girl's state while slowly speeding up. In fact, the speed was not very fast, but the little girl was very excited. She happily giggled and said, "Papa, come on. Papa, come on." It was really much more fun than riding a big cat. Hohai had not completely frozen, and the skating rink had not been opened, so now Shikahai looked a little deserted. The weather was still too cold, so the family of three returned home after a round. In the evening, after the little girl fell asleep, Qin Ruoying finally began to cultivate. She had figured it out. If she neglected her daughter because of cultivation, then she was not worthy of being Nian Yan's mother. In a dark room, The little girl fell asleep sweetly, while Xianxia and Qin Ruing sat cross-legged on her left and right. Suddenly, Xianxia opened his eyes. Chapter 132. Outside the house, the cold wind was whistling. The big pit that Xianxia had stepped on had been covered with a shallow layer of snow. The blue stone floor was broken into pieces, protruding in the east and concave in the west. There were thousands of gullies, and if one was not careful, one would slide down. Seeing that the little fellow's activity area was suddenly missing such a large area because of him, Xianxia thought that he should find someone to repair it tomorrow, so that the little fellow could continue to gallop in the yard. Perhaps he could also buy her a set of children's outdoor expansion equipment. Just like the large-scale expansion equipment in the shopping mall, there were tire arrays, rock climbing, balance boards, ring bridges, scaling ladders, and so on. It was very playable and could also be used to train the little fellow's balance, athletic ability, coordination ability, and many other aspects. Xianxia did not consider letting the little fellow cultivate for the time being. That was because Nian still had to go to school in the future. At that time, she would definitely play with other children in school. If she lost control a little and slapped other children, it would be troublesome. Therefore, it would not be too late to teach her cultivation when she was a little more sensible. While thinking, Xianxia flew out of the yard. He wanted to go out and find another place to cultivate. Although the spiritual energy of heaven and earth near Shikahai was very rich, now his wife, sister-in-law, and father-in-law were all cultivating here. The cultivation of the three of them was still shallow, so it didn't matter if they were crowded together. However, Xianxia's cultivation was too high, so he must not stay with them. Because once he started cultivating, he would immediately form a spiritual energy black hole in the courtyard, sucking all the spiritual energy of heaven and earth nearby into his body. How could others cultivate like this? Therefore, Xianxia could only come out and find another place. Since returning to earth, Xianxia had never deliberately wanted to cultivate. The reason why he changed his mind now was that after the battle with the Divine General, he suddenly had a sense of crisis. If he began to wholeheartedly restore his cultivation after returning to earth, why would he waste a drop of blood essence today? Strength was the basic guarantee of a happy life. In order to make his happy life last longer, Xianxia decided to start cultivating seriously. In the past, he had nothing to live for, but now he was full of happiness, so his fighting spirit was high. If he wanted to cultivate, he had to first find a suitable blessed enclave. Blessed enclaves were usually located in places where there were very few people. For example, in the mountains and on the islands, it was very easy for blessed lands to appear. The so-called blessed enclave was actually a place with dense heaven and earth spirit qi. As the capital of the country, Shangjing's geographical location was excellent. It was located at the intersection of the plains and the mountains. The steep mountains, the rushing rivers, and the fertile plains were all in one place. It was a treasure trove of wind and water. It was also the best place to build the capital. There were two mountain ranges in the vicinity. The Taihang mountain range ran from the north to the south, and was majestic. The Yan mountain range ran from the west to the east, and was vast and boundless. To the west was Taihang mountain, and to the north was Mount Yan. Mount Yan was still a bit small and not grand enough, so Xianxia thought for a moment and directly eliminated Mount Yan. Now that the tourism industry was developed, places with slightly better scenery were all listed as scenic spots. It was estimated that when the big cat was looking for a place to cultivate, it also took a lot of effort to find Mount Thamay. Xianxia flew and searched. It wasn't until he flew over the Spirit Mountain in the western suburbs of Shangjing that he finally found a remote place with dense heaven and earth spirit qi. This mountain range was steep, and it was estimated to be more than 2,000 meters above sea level. The top of the mountain was already covered with a thick layer of snow. Standing on the top of the mountain, when the clouds surged, the clouds paved a road, and people walked in the sky. It was like a fairyland. Xianxia looked around, and after confirming that there was no one else around, he sat cross-legged on a large rock at the top of the mountain and began cultivating. As he gradually entered the state, Xianxia's body seemed to turn into a black hole, and the surrounding heaven and earth spirit chi rushed towards him. Within a radius of tens of meters, there was strangely no wind, like a color photo, and everything seemed to be still. On the top of the snowy mountain, a bright moon hung in the sky, and the surrounding stars were overshadowed. Time flew. When Xianxia opened his eyes again, the sun on the horizon just happened to show a corner of the clouds. Thousands of clusters of golden arrows burst out from the clouds and reflected on his body, as if covering him with a golden gauze. Cultivation was dry and boring to begin with, because it was a process that accumulated over time. Xianxia was not in a hurry. After seeing the sun rise, he immediately got up and left the top of the mountain, because he had to go back to prepare breakfast for the little fellow. Qin Ruing now also made up her mind to accompany Nian during the day and find time to cultivate at night. She wanted to let the little fellow deeply feel what was called motherly love. Of course, this kind of love was not without limits. Appropriate love was called doting. Once it went beyond the limit, it became doting. To any child, being spoiled was definitely not beneficial. Qin Ruing also put in a lot of effort. Although she had only been with Nian for a few days, she was very keen to find a problem that had not yet occurred. Nian was very smart and sensible, and she rarely lost her temper. Although sometimes she also liked to make trouble, more often than not, Nian liked to quietly watch cartoons with the big cat. Nian never seemed to be very interested in the outside world. Playing games with her parents, watching cartoons with the big cat. This was all the content of her life. This way of life was absolutely wrong, because she lacked communication with her peers, and also relatively lacked the psychological and ability to socialize. Although the big cat was a monster, and its intelligence was far superior to that of a child, it could not speak, so there was no way to communicate with the little fellow. If the child had too little contact with the outside world from a young age, it may lead to an extremely serious consequence. That was, when the child grew up, he or she would become more and more withdrawn. If it was more serious, it would even evolve into a psychological illness, such as low self-esteem, autism, depression, and so on. As a parent, in the child's growth process, it was obvious that they should take the initiative to create opportunities for the child to interact with strangers and unfamiliar environments, to increase the child's ability to socialize and adapt to the environment, and to cultivate a cheerful and optimistic character. Qin Ruing looked at the little fellow who immediately climbed into bed after breakfast. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong, so she quickly told this problem to Xianxia. And when Xianxia heard what she said, he immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. After all, Aunt Zhang was old and in poor health, so she rarely took Nian out to play with other children. And after he came back, it seemed that he did not take Nian to play with other children. At most, he let the little fellow go to kindergarten, but after a few days, he did not go. No. According to this progress, it seemed that Nian was likely to become more and more withdrawn. She looked very outgoing now, but that was because she stayed by her parents' side all day long. She could not be so introverted in front of her parents, right? What to do? Chapter 133. Walking side by side with me is obviously a tough task for a loner like him. The man in the condom. Humans were social creatures. Some Western scholars even categorized loners who do not socialize with others as antisocial personalities, because this in itself was a sign of morbidity. Being antisocial was different from being alone. Lonely people yearned to socialize with others. They would not be bored with anyone, and they would not even be on guard against everyone. Antisocial people were a kind of personality defect. They usually thought highly of themselves and looked down on others, but their hearts were extremely weak. They were afraid of being stabbed, so they did not want to socialize with others. When they had to socialize with others, antisocial people would also appear to behave strangely, and pretentiously. They always gave people a feeling of nervousness. They were actually very pitiful. They did not necessarily have antisocial psychology or violent tendencies, but they definitely felt autistic, lost, inferior, nervous, and depressed. They were unable to communicate with others normally, which made them prefer to be alone and live in isolation from others. There were not many congenital factors for the formation of antisocial personality. It was mainly due to the negative influence of various subjective and objective environments, which caused the psychological distortion caused by long-term depression. For example, if Nian continued like this, when she went to primary school in the future, it was likely that she would be ostracized by her classmates because she did not learn to communicate with her peers. She would be treated as an anomaly by her classmates. A little girl who only knew how to chat with cats all day. Was that not weird enough? The results of the survey showed that about 5% to 8% of the children in primary and secondary school groups would be antisocial. And this was already an extremely exaggerated number. Out of 20 people, there would be one antisocial individual. The class was a group, and antisocial children were always unable to integrate into this group. As a result, they were more likely to be ridiculed, ostracized, and criticized by their classmates. This situation would gradually decrease as the child grew older. However, this process was incomparably long for those pitiful children who were reclusive and eccentric. They would endure all kinds of psychological pressure, but in the end, they would only become a stepping stone in the growth process of others. Many years later, who would remember the freak who was ridiculed and teased in the class? Who would care if that freak was doing well now? Xianxia panicked. After all, he really couldn't cure mental illness. After some serious consideration, he quickly discussed with Qin Rung, how about sending Nian to kindergarten? Hearing this, Qin Rung immediately nodded. How did he raise the child like this? Thinking of this, Xianxia couldn't help but fall into deep reflection. Seeing that the little fellow had flipped out, Qin Rung also sat next to her. After gently helping the little fellow up, she patiently asked, Nian, can you tell us why you don't want to go to kindergarten? After hearing this question, the little fellow was stunned for a moment. But right after that, she burst into tears. This time, Qin Rung also panicked. She quickly took her into her arms and comforted her softly. Nian, don't cry. If you don't want to go, we won't force you. But you have to tell us why you don't want to go, right? The little fellow cried miserably. Seeing this, Xianxia hurriedly went to the bathroom and brought her a hot towel. The husband and wife worked together and spent a great deal of effort to stop the little fellow from crying. After a while, the little fellow sobbed, pursed her lips, and said very sadly, I don't want to go to kindergarten. I want to be with Papa and Mama. Hearing this, Qin Rung couldn't help but look at Xianxia and instantly understood the reason. This poor child, she was raised by Aunt Zhang alone before, and her parents were never by her side. Therefore, when the little fellow had her parents again, she didn't want to be separated from them for a moment. And this was obviously the root cause of her recent muddle-headedness. Since the child said so, it was obvious that she couldn't go to kindergarten. Qin Rung held Nian in her arms and thought for a while. Suddenly, she said to Xianxia, how about we change the way? Look at the cold weather, there aren't many parents who would bring their children out to play. Nian doesn't want to go to kindergarten. It's definitely not a way to go on. How about this? Let's open a bookstore or a restaurant or a coffee shop so that Nian can meet many strangers. Chapter 134. Open a shop? This idea seems to be good? Of course, if it was other seasons, there would be no need to go through so much trouble. He could just take Nian out to Hohai every day. Over time, she would naturally meet some new friends. But unfortunately, it was winter now, and it was winter in the north. The temperature was low and the wind was strong. Before the ice skating rink was officially opened, the popularity of Shikahai during the day was very bleak. Of course, the so-called bleak popularity refers to the daytime. Hohai was really lively at night. If Sanlaton's bar street was trendy, then Hohai's bar street would undoubtedly be artistic. A small alley near the sea. There was no noisy music. The melodious singing coupled with the unique charm of the old Shangjing was definitely a melodious elegy in the modern city. It was really good to open a shop in this kind of artistic and fresh place. Anyway, they were idle all day. Opening a shop to take care of the little guy could also add some fun to their life. Thinking about it, it was also quite good. But the question was, what kind of shop should they open? Xianxia didn't have any ideas. Since it was Qin Ruing's suggestion, he might as well listen to her opinion. So he smiled and asked, "What kind of shop do you want to open?" Hearing this, Qin Ruing frowned and pondered. They weren't short of money. Opening a shop was purely for fun and to create a new living environment for the little guy. The business couldn't be too good. If it was too good, they wouldn't have time to take care of the child. But it couldn't be too bad. If it was too bad, they could only stare blankly at the door all day. It was better not to open. After thinking for a while, Qin Ruing couldn't think of a reason, so she proposed to go out and look at the shops around. Hohai Bar Street was formed after the end of the SARS, more than 10 years ago at an incomprehensible speed. She still vaguely remembered that there were only a few small pubs here before. But now, looking around, Hohai was densely packed with small pubs on both sides. The family of 3 walked around Hohai. The more Qin Ruing looked, the more dissatisfied she was. Xianxia saw this, but he didn't say anything. When the little fellow ran to the railing and checked whether the lake water was frozen, Xianxia suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, we only opened the shop to let Nian come into contact with more people. As for what kind of shop we open, it doesn't really matter." Hearing this, Qin Ruing couldn't help but be stunned. After carefully thinking about Xianxia's words, she said with some hesitation, "I was wrong. Most of the places here are bars. It's really not suitable to open a bookstore." In fact, Qin Ruing wanted to open a bookstore the most. However, Hohai was still a relatively mature business circle. Hohai Bar Street's reputation was comparable to Sanlitun and Workers' Sports Complex. Therefore, other than bars, there were only a few tea houses, restaurants, food stalls, and so on. There weren't even many supermarkets. Fame had already determined that other shops couldn't survive here. Therefore, Qin Ruing thought for a long time, but still couldn't think of what kind of shop they should open. Xianxia saw her hesitation and suggested with a smile, "Didn't you see a tea house with a shop for sale sign outside? How about we take it over?" Tea house? Qin Ruing was a bit surprised, but after seeing Xianxia's serious expression, she had to seriously consider this proposal. In fact, compared to a tea house, Qin Ruing was more inclined to a coffee shop. But unfortunately, coffee was a Western culture. Therefore, after coming to Hohai, a place with a strong folkloric flavor, it was somewhat unsuitable. When they were walking along the road, they already saw several closed coffee shops. Wuxia had a tea culture since ancient times. Tea was popular in the Tang dynasty and flourished in the Song dynasty. From the emperor, to the literati, to the common people, there was no one who didn't like tea. In the eyes of many young people, the style of coffee seemed to be much higher than tea. But in fact, coffee, cocoa, and tea were known as the 3 non-alcoholic drinks in the world. Silk, porcelain, and tea, these were also the business cards that Wuxia handed to the world. Before the bar street in Hohai rose, there were many tea houses here. Every summer, Hohai Lake was wide, the water was sparkling, willows were hanging on both sides of the lake, lights were shining, and the palace walls and minarets in the distance were reflected in the water. From time to time, there were pleasure boats gently rowing. If at this time, there was a pot of good tea, sitting quietly by the lake and carefully tasting it, wouldn't it be pleasant? This was a kind of cultural charm, belonging to Wuxia, and also belonging to Hohai. Qin Ruing was moved. Therefore, the couple immediately reached an agreement, called the little girl, and turned to the tea house with a shop for sale sign. The owner was a middle-aged man in his 40s. After hearing Xianxia's intention, he immediately enthusiastically introduced the tea house to them. The size of the tea house was not bad, the lobby was about 70 to 80 square meters, and there was a small courtyard of more than 50 square meters in the back. The overall decoration was very antique, exquisite, and elegant. The shop was the owner's own. Because the business of the tea house was not very good, the owner did not intend to continue to operate, and was ready to rent out the shop to collect rent. The price of a shop in Hohai was not cheap. The better location of the shop, the rent for 1 square meter fluctuated around 300 yuan. In other words, such a large shop, the monthly rent would be at least 40,000 yuan. In a year, the rent alone was close to 500,000 yuan. It was really like an inch of land was worth an inch of gold. Because the owner was the landlord, the transfer fee was saved, but the renovation fee still had to be paid. Xianxia had a lot of money, but he did not want to be a sucker, so he negotiated the price with the owner. After some bargaining, the owner agreed to only charge 200,000 yuan for the renovation fee. The stock in the shop would be calculated separately, and the rent would be 35,000 a month, paid once a year, plus a month's deposit. In order to prevent Xianxia from saying that he was randomly charging the renovation fee, the owner even took out his previous renovation fee list, repeatedly saying that he spent 500,000 to renovate the shop, and if Xianxia rented it to someone else, he would receive 400,000 just for the transfer fee. Although he said so, it was up to Xianxia whether he believed it or not. After all, this was not a small matter, so the owner thought that the young couple would go back to discuss it. But what he did not expect was that the young couple did not hesitate for long. The two simply discussed a few words and directly decided to rent. The price was agreed, then the next step was simple: look at the property certificate, sign the contract, clear the account, check the goods, pay the money, and a happy cooperation. The transfer of a shop was actually a very troublesome matter. If you want to change the name of the shop or change the type of business, then you have to let the owner go to the Trade and Commerce Bureau to cancel the original business license, and then Xianxia would go to register again. Xianxia found it troublesome, so he was too lazy to even change the name. Seeing that he was so straightforward, the owner signed an agreement with him, and then handed over the original business license to him. Therefore, in less than a day, this tea house, which was not far from Dongming Alley and adjacent to Hohai, had completely changed owners. Qingyi Tea House. This was the new business of the family of three. While Xianxia was signing the contract with the owner, the little girl took the big cat to wander around the tea house, from time to time touching here and there, as if she was very interested in this place. When Qin Ring saw her like this, her heart immediately felt relieved. Chapter 135. The next day, the little fellow was woken up by the sound of bricks colliding. She opened her eyes in a daze, climbed to the window, and found that a group of strangers were moving bluestones into the yard. Xianxia stood in the yard and directed the workers. When Qin Ring saw the little fellow get up, she immediately came to her and prepared to help her get up. "Mama, what are they doing?" "The yard is broken. Papa asked someone to repair it. After that, you can play in the yard again. Papa is so nice." Hearing this, Qin Ring immediately pinched her little face and asked, "What about Mama?" "Mama is so nice." The little fellow flattered, and Qin Ring immediately laughed. After gently picking up the little fellow from the bed, she smiled and said, "Let's go. Mama will take you to wash up." But to repair the yard, first of all, the broken bluestone slabs had to be swept out, and then the mud from outside to fill the big hole. After that, the bluestone slabs could be laid again. The workers made a lot of noise. Qin Xueqing frowned and came out to take a look. Then she slammed the door and went back to the east wing. Recently, she and Qin Yongyan had been completely obsessed with cultivation. They often didn't even go out for a whole day. Xianxia didn't ask them to eat now. Anyway, after the family of three had eaten, Xianxia would put all the leftovers into the insulated cabinet. When Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan were hungry, they naturally knew to eat by themselves. After breakfast, Xianxia briefly explained to the person in charge of the decoration company that they must finish the work today. After that, the family of three went out. The original owner of the tea house was a very particular person. When he left yesterday, he had carefully cleaned the tea house. After a brief check, Xianxia took out a sign from the bar and hung it outside the door. It was open. He didn't even change the sign. He didn't know if there would be any old customers. Xianxia sat at the bar and seriously warned the little girl to be sweet and polite, and to take the initiative to greet the guests when they came in. After the little fellow listened to his incessant warning, she nodded her little head numbly. It was unknown whether she understood or not. Xianxia had already seen the boss's account book before, and the business was indeed not good. Because it was winter, there was basically no business in the tea house in the morning. It was only slightly better in the afternoon. Many customers who came to the bar because of its reputation would sit in the tea house with their friends for a while, chatting and playing cards before the bar opened. The tea house was open, and even the signboard was still the same. However, Xianxia had overlooked a very important issue. That was, opening a tea house required a certain amount of connections. The tea house itself was a business of acquaintances, and the gathering and dispersing of qi were closely related to the boss. A successful tea house must have a boss who could be called a social expert. The customers came for the boss, but they also dispersed because of the boss. Therefore, there was a saying often heard in the tea houses that business was good as long as the boss was there. If the boss was not there, there would be no ghosts. On the right side of the lobby, there was a bookshelf next to the window seat, on which were some of the world's classics that the former boss had bought before. Qin Ruing casually flipped through, then picked up a book called Love in the Time of Cholera, and sat in the booth to read it. Seeing this, Xianxia poured a cup of tea and asked the little fellow to bring it to her. "Nyan, come, bring a cup of tea to mommy. Be careful, don't burn yourself." In order to make it convenient for the little fellow to take, Xianxia specially chose a hand cup and only mixed 2/3 of the water. The little fellow held the cup with both hands and walked very slowly. When she carefully came to Qin Ruing's side, she sweetly shouted, "Mommy, drink tea." Qin Ruing read carefully, so when the little fellow called her, she found that the little fellow was still holding the teacup, so she quickly took the teacup from the little fellow's hand, and at the same time did not forget to praise, "Ah, Nyan is so good." The little fellow was happy and seemed to think that it was a very pleasant thing to serve tea to others, so she immediately turned and ran to the bar, looked up at Xianxia and asked, "Papa, when will the guest come?" Don't worry, take your time. The most important thing to do business is to be patient." Xianxia smiled and held her in his arms, and then the father and daughter sat behind the bar and chatted. The door opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. After waiting for 2 hours in boredom, the family of 3 finally welcomed their first guest after the opening. To Xianxia's surprise, the guest did not belong to the middle-aged group, but was a young girl. The girl stood outside the door and hesitated for a moment. After looking at the business sign outside the door, she pushed the door and walked in. She wasn't very old and looked to be about 20 years old. She should be at the age of a down jacket and jeans, but now she was wearing a long coat that did not match her temperament at all, and a combination of pantyhose and boots on the lower half of her body. The girl had put on makeup. Perhaps it was due to her poor technique, but her makeup gave off a strange feeling. Obviously, she was a natural hibiscus, but she had to paint a snake with legs and dress herself up a little. Of course, it would make people feel a little strange. Chapter 136. After Qiao Yuan came, 3 more guests came one after another. They were all middle-aged, and it was obvious that they were regulars in the tea house. The 3 of them joked as they pushed open the door of the tea house, but after entering, they couldn't help but be stunned. One of them looked around the lobby with some doubts. After making sure that he didn't go in the wrong way, he looked at Xianxia behind the bar and asked, "Where's old Su?" Hearing this, Xianxia explained with a smile, "This shop has been transferred. I'm the new owner here. Do you need anything?" "Oh," the man frowned and nodded, then turned to discuss with his companions. After the 3 of them whispered a few words, the one who spoke before said to Xianxia, "3 cups of plain tea." "Okay, please sit wherever you want." After that, they walked directly to the booth behind Qin Ruing, as if they were very familiar with this place. After seeing them come over, Qin Ruing hesitated for a moment, then took the book back to the bar. After all, she was the lady boss. It was not good to always occupy the best seat. Xianxia took out 3 cups from the cabinet. The little girl reached out to take it, but Xianxia hurriedly stopped her and said with a smile, "Don't worry, you can't take 3 cups. Daddy will help you." "Okay." The little girl took back her little hand and nodded obediently. After Xianxia handed the cup to her, the little girl carefully followed behind Xianxia with the cup and walked toward the 3 people. "Oh boss, is this your daughter?" "Well, yes." "How old is she?" 4.5 years old. Seeing the little girl eagerly following behind Xianxia, the person who spoke just now couldn't help but exclaim, "Your daughter is so cute, she's exactly the same as my little one when she was young." Xianxia smiled very politely, then patted the little girl's head and said to her, "Nian, uncle is praising you. You're cute, quickly say thank you to uncle." Hearing this, the little girl said sweetly, "Thank you, uncle." "Oh, your child is so cute." "That's right. Why didn't my wife give me a daughter back then?" "Come on, with your shabby appearance, how could you give birth to such a beautiful daughter?" "In my opinion, if your wife had really given birth to such a beautiful daughter for you, I'm afraid you would have taken her for a paternity test long ago." "Bah, you can't spit out ivory from your dog mouth." The three of them seemed to have a good relationship with each other. Xianxia stood to the side and listened for a while, then said with a smile, "Please sit down. If there's anything you need, just tell me." "'Kay boss, you don't mind us." A happy's family was always eye-catching. Therefore, Xiao Yuan had been secretly sizing up the family of three sitting behind the bar. The boss was handsome, and the lady boss was beautiful and virtuous. Xiao Yuan was still savoring the taste of the black tea when her phone suddenly rang. Xiao Yuan quickly picked up the phone, and a man's voice sounded on the other end. "Xiao, you're in luck today. The bill is issued before noon. Come quickly, you can still get lunch, and okay, I'll be right there." After hanging up the phone, Xiao Yuan shouted to Xianxia, "Boss, the bill." Hearing this, Xianxia immediately patted the little girl and said with a smile, "Nian, go collect the money, 38 yuan, remember to count it." The little girl thought for a moment and nodded. Then she jumped down from Qin Ruing's arms and ran directly to Xiao Yuan. She imitated Xianxia and said, "Sister, 38 yuan." Xiao Yuan took out 2 20s and handed them directly to the little girl when she came over. The little girl took the money and then ran back to the bar. "Papa here." Seeing this, Xianxia and Qin Ruing couldn't help looking at each other, and both of them laughed. The child didn't know how to add and subtract. It was simply deliberately making things difficult for her to count the money. "Sister gave too much money, so we have to give her change. Come on, Nian, give these 2 yuan to sister." The little girl was a little confused. However, after hearing Xianxia's words, she obediently took the 2 yuan and then ran quickly to Xiao Yuan. At this time, Xiao Yuan had already gotten up and was ready to go out. She seemed to have forgotten that the boss should give her change of 2 yuan. Seeing that she was about to push the door open and leave, the little girl hurriedly shouted, "Sister, your money." As she spoke, the little girl waved the money in her hand and ran excitedly to Xiao Yuan's side. Xiao Yuan raised her head and handed the 2 yuan to her. Xiao Yuan stopped and turned to take the 2 yuan in the little girl's hand. She touched her head and said with a smile, "Thank you, sister. Can you tell me your name?" "My name is Chen. Sister, you can call me Nian." After that, the little girl immediately ran back to the bar, seeming a little embarrassed. "Goodbye, Nian. I'll come to see you tomorrow." Xiao Yuan smiled and shouted at the little girl's back. The little girl didn't look back, so she looked at the couple behind the bar and politely waved to them before leaving. Seeing this, Xianxia smiled at her in response. Xiao Yuan left. Every day was like this, so in just a few days, she was very familiar with Nian. Xianxia found out from chatting with her that Xiao Yuan was a junior at Beijing Normal University. The reason she came here every day was that she recently found a part-time job in Hohai. Her part-time job seemed a bit strange. After 3 days, she only went to work on the first day. For the next 2 days, she sat in the tea house all day reading and only left in the afternoon. Although Xiao Yuan did not say what her part-time job was, Xianxia thought it might be related to the bar. This afternoon, including Xiao Yuan, there were only 3 tables of customers in the tea house. Suddenly, there was a sudden sound of tires braking on the street outside, followed by a burst of shouting. A customer was alarmed, so he curiously went out of the tea house to take a look. When he went out, he saw a large group of people standing in front of a bar not far away. It was not the opening hours of the bar, and those people did not look like they were here to drink. Some of them seemed to be here to make trouble. This was Hohai, Sigio City, under the emperor's feet. It was strange that someone dared to make trouble here in broad daylight. The customer looked around and then asked his friends to come out and take a look. Qin Ruoying saw this and followed him out. Xiao Yuan sat by the window, so she wanted to see the situation outside through the window. But at this moment, her phone suddenly rang, giving her a fright. Xiao Yuan answered the phone. After listening to a few words, her face changed greatly. She quickly hung up the phone, stood up from her seat, and looked around the tea house at a loss. She ran directly to the bar and then said to Qin Shi with a pleading face, "Boss, can you let me hide here for a while?" Chapter 138. There was an empty space below the bar, which was just enough for one person to hide. When Qin Shi heard what she said, he was instantly amused. So the commotion outside was caused by her? Xiao Yuan gave Qin Shi a good impression of her. She seemed to be like Lin Xian in the past, with poor family conditions, which was why she chose to work part-time in her spare time. Although she deliberately dressed herself up to the nines, she still faintly emitted a reserved and inexperienced aura that belonged to her age. And this was not something that could be covered up by makeup and dressing up. "Then you sit here, I'll go out and take a look at the situation." As he spoke, Qin Shi stood up and gave up his chair. When Xiao Yuan saw this, she immediately squatted behind his chair, trying to use the bar and chair to hide her figure. When the little girl saw her sneaking around, she was instantly delighted. After clapping her hands to signal Qin Shi to put her down, the little girl ran directly in front of Xiao Yuan and said excitedly, "Sister, do you want to play hide and seek? I can play with you." Hearing this, Xiao Yuan could not help but be speechless. After nervously making a shu gesture, she then said softly to the little girl, "Nian Nian, don't talk to me, just pretend you didn't see me." The little girl looked at her blankly, as if she did not understand what she meant. Xiao Yuan thought for a while, then changed her way of saying, "There are bad people coming to catch me, you don't want sister to be caught by bad people, right?" When she heard this, the little girl finally understood. Hence, the little girl immediately shook her little head like a rattledrum, and at the same time, did not forget to say righteously, "Sister, don't be afraid. I'll protect you. Shoo. Just pretend you didn't see me." Seeing that Xiao Yuan was trying to explain the situation to the little girl with a conflicted expression, Qin Shi could not help but smile slightly. He stood behind the little girl, gently carried her up, then said to her, "Let sister stay here for a while, Daddy will bring you out to watch the commotion." Seeing that Qin Shi had rescued her from the evil clutches of the little fellow, Xiao Yuan immediately let out a sigh of relief. Then, she looked at Qin Shi with a complicated expression and said softly, "Boss, thank you." Hearing this, Qin Shi smiled at her and comforted her. "It's uncomfortable to squat. Sit on the chair. If you're really scared, I suggest you call the police now." After that, Qin Shi carried the little fellow out of the bar. Looking at his back as he left, Xiao Yuan looked down at the phone in her hand thoughtfully. But after a moment of hesitation, she still put the phone in her bag. Then she hid under the bar counter, trying to hide better. Outside the tea house. When Qin Ruoying saw Qin Shi carrying the little fellow out, she immediately came to his side. A red wine that cost more than 10 yuan would be sold here for 1,888 yuan and 3,888 yuan. A black-hearted person could even ask for 8,888 yuan directly. If the fat sheep refused to pay, then sorry, the shill bar's hatchet man would come out. It was not a real fight, but a threat. If he did not pay, he would not leave. A smarter fat sheep would ask to share with the bartenders, only give half of the money, and then call the police afterwards. However, it was a pity that the industry itself was in a gray area. As long as the boss of the shill bar was smart, even if the fat sheep called the police afterwards, the boss only needed to refund the money, because they did not break the law. There was a price list on each table. The price was clearly marked, and it was voluntary. Xiao Yuan was obviously a bartender's. But what was strange was that the fat sheep were generally spendthrifts who did not have much social experience. This group of young people who blocked the door of the bar and made trouble were not good people at first glance. To put it bluntly, they were not cut out to be fat sheep. What the hell was going on here? She held the little fellow outside the tea house and watched the bustle. At this time, someone said, "She's in the tea house over there." After the group of people heard this sentence, they immediately rushed in the direction of Xianxia. Several guests in the tea house were still happily watching the bustle, but when they saw the group of people suddenly coming over, they quickly hid to the side. There was a street outside the tea house, and across the street was Hohai. Xianxia and Qin Ruing stood side by side at the entrance of the tea house. After the group of young people came over, they surrounded them. The little fellow was obviously frightened by their formation, so he immediately shrank back into Xianxia's arms. Seeing this, Xianxia handed the little fellow to Qin Ruing, and then motioned her to take the child in first. Chapter 139. Xianxia calmly looked at the group of young people in front of him. Among the group of young people, the youngest was about 20 years old, and the oldest was no more than 25 years old. They were all dressed very fashionably, and a few of them were very handsome. However, they did not stand properly, and the moment they opened their mouths were full of obscenities, inadvertently giving people a frivolous and vulgar feeling. The leader was about 24 or 25 years old. After his companions surrounded the door of the tea house, he stood in front of Xianxia with a cigarette in his mouth. As if he wanted to create momentum for himself, the young man didn't hold back and directly blew a smoke ring at Xianxia. However, he didn't expect the wind to be very strong today. So just as he blew out the smoke ring, a sudden gust of wind blew the smoke ring directly into his face. Choked by the smoke, the young man immediately lowered his head and couldn't help but rub his eyes. As a result, the imposing manner that he had deliberately created was destroyed and completely disappeared. This young man was called Wang Hao, and he was also a famous person in Shangjing's nightclub circle. Whenever it was night time, it was time for Wang Hao to shuttle through the major bars. Recently, Wuxia suddenly set off a hip-hop craze, just like the rock craze of the 80s and 90s, which suddenly became popular all over the country. Wang Hao was one of the first underground rappers. After catching up with the hip-hop craze, he was also in the limelight in Shangjing. Most of the bars in Hohai were small bars, so Wang Hao wasn't familiar with this area. The reason why he brought people here today was because one of his brothers was cheated of money by a bartender. His brother was related to him and just came out from his hometown to mingle with him. Before, he was a very honest person and didn't see much of the world, so he didn't understand the twists and turns of the bar. After chatting with the keyboard player online for a while, the brothers suddenly became hot-headed and wanted to ask the girl to come out and meet. Coincidentally, the bartender that the boss arranged for him was Xiao Yuan. In terms of appearance, Xiao Yuan's appearance was definitely the best among the group of bartenders. As a young man who had just come to Shangjing, when had he ever been in close contact with a beauty of this level? Therefore, he was mesmerized by Xiao Yuan at that time. Xiao Yuan didn't say much to him before he excitedly ordered some wine. The more he drank, the more confused he became. In the end, he directly opened a big order of 20,000 yuan. 20,000 yuan, 20% for the keyboard, 40% for the bartender, and another 40% for the boss. After the order was confirmed, Xiao Yuan would get 8,000 yuan. Usually, the bill would only be settled once every half a month or a month. That was because if the customer called the police, the bill would be refunded. The glass seemed to be tempered glass, and the stone only made a loud collision sound when it hit it. The stone fell to the ground, but the glass didn't move. The young man was not convinced. After fiercely staring at Xianxia, he picked up the stone from the ground again. But this time, he didn't smash the stone out. Instead, he stood directly in front of the glass window with the stone. Bang! 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 The young man held the stone and smashed the glass with all his strength. Qin Ruing sat on the chair next to Xiao Yuan with the little girl in her arms. The little girl shrank in Qin Ruing's arms. This movement not only scared the little girl, but also the guests in the tea house. Seeing that the young man kept smashing the glass with the stone, the guests retreated to the corner. This group of young people was simply lawless. The young man smashed the stone for a while, but there was still no trace of damage on the glass. At this moment, Xianxia spoke. "That's tempered glass. Be careful, don't hurt your own hand and come back to me later to pay for the medical expenses." As soon as he finished speaking, the young man picked up the stone and smashed it again as if he didn't hear him at all. Bang! The loud collision sounded again. Immediately after, the young man suddenly let out a wail that sounded like a pig being slaughtered. Everyone hurriedly turned to look, only to see him covering his right hand with his left hand and constantly shouting. Blood dripped down from his fingers. It seemed that Xianxia was right. Chapter 140. Smashing the glass and injuring his own hand? This sudden turn of events shocked everyone present. It seems to be quite serious? Quickly take him to the doctor to stop the bleeding. Turn left on the street, there is a small clinic less than 200 meters away. Seeing that the young man's hand was bleeding profusely, Xianxia reminded Wang Hao with a smile. After hearing Xianxia's words, Wang Hao seemed to have finally come back to his senses. He hurriedly asked someone to take the injured person to the clinic to stop the bleeding. After the injured person left, the group of young people in front of him could not help but look at each other. They wanted to smash someone else's glass as a demonstration, but they did not expect to injure their own hand instead of breaking the glass. This was truly a great loss of face. Wang Hao coughed a little awkwardly. But immediately after, he said to Xianxia with some annoyance, "Boss, I didn't bring so many brothers here today to stand here in the cold wind. You opened the door to do business, so you should know that it's better to avoid trouble. How about you let the girl come out, and we'll part on good terms?" Xianxia did not respond. Instead, he smiled and shook his head. "Xin, do you believe that we'll smash your broken tea house?" It was unknown who had suddenly said such a sentence. Hearing this, Xianxia thought for a moment, then asked with some doubt, "Didn't we smash it just now?" As soon as these words came out, it was like a spark falling into a pile of gunpowder. The group of young people in front of him was instantly ignited by him. A few of the hot-tempered ones were about to rush up on the spot. Looking at their aggressive postures, it seemed like they were about to make a move. However, before Xianxia could react, Wang Hao had already opened his arms and stopped them. Wang Hao was not stupid, and he was already past the age of fighting for personal feelings. Although he usually acted extremely arrogantly, in reality he was very measured in his actions. This was not a small county, but the capital of Wuxia, Shangjing. The water in Shangjing was very deep. If you casually threw a brick on the street, it could hit a big shot that they absolutely could not afford to offend. Wang Hao had come from a small county and had finally made a name for himself. So how could he do something as stupid as taking the lead to cause trouble? Even if they wanted to make a scene, they would only do so after he left. Just like wine stalls, every industry had its own rules of survival. Throwing stones and smashing glass was actually not a problem at all. Even if they rushed in and smashed things up, they would only need to pay some money in the end. Article 275 of the criminal law clearly stipulates that, in cases of intentional destruction of property, if the loss of public or private property exceeds 5,000 renminbi, the case shall be filed for prosecution. Qin Ruing's voice was very soft and gentle, but every word pierced Xiao Yuan's heart. Xiao Yuan lowered her head in silence. After a long while, her tears flowed down silently. Seeing that his wife was about to talk about life ideals with others, Xianxia held the little fellow and sat in the center of the lobby, leaving some private space for them. Xiao Yuan sobbed in a low voice. Qin Ruing waited for a moment, then took out a few tissues and handed them to her. "Can you tell me why?" Xiao Yuan took the tissues and wiped her tears. After taking a deep breath, she looked at Qin Ruoying and said sadly, "My father is sick. He needs money. I've done a lot of work, but I can't make any money. Someone recommended me to work in a KTV. I was afraid, so I didn't go. But I really need money, so they recommended me to be a prostitute." Xiao Yuan's family was very ordinary. Her father was a middle school teacher, and her mother was an elementary school teacher. Their income was not high. They relied on her father's tuition classes to earn some extra money. Their family barely reached the standard of a well-off family. She was a very happy girl. Although her family was not rich, she did not have to worry about food and clothing. Her family was happy. She could be regarded as a pretty girl in a small family. Xiao Yuan also worked hard. She was the top liberal arts scholar in her county during the college entrance examination. However, sometimes the reality was more cliché than stories. After all, life was like an electrocardiogram. If it was smooth sailing, it meant that you were dead. 3 years ago, Xiao Yuan's father was diagnosed with chronic uremia. So there were only 2 paths left in front of them: lifelong dialysis or kidney transplant. The price of dialysis was not too expensive. The charge was slightly different in each place. The price of a single dialysis was about 400 yuan. A patient had to undergo dialysis at least 3 or 4 times a week, about 13 times a month. It cost 5,200 yuan, about 60,000 yuan a year. 60,000 yuan didn't sound like much. However, for an ordinary family in a small county, this was already a huge expense. Because of his health, Xiao Yuan's father was forced to close the tuition classes. However, he did not quit. Instead, he insisted on going to work every day. Xiao Yuan's father often said, Xiao, don't worry about family matters. Just study hard. When you graduate and find a good job, Dad can enjoy life." This illness was not life-threatening for a while, but it would put a lot of financial pressure on a family. So every time Xiao Yuan returned home, she would feel that her parents had aged a lot. It was also because of this that Xiao Yuan worked part-time while studying hard to earn scholarships since her freshman year. She had done many jobs, such as waitress, tutor, courier, and part-time model. Part-time model was the fastest way to earn money, but this kind of good thing was not common. Chapter 142. After listening to Xiao Yuan's story for a few minutes, there was a burst of sirens on the street outside. The Ministry of Public Security's 110 Police Service Standardization Standards clearly stated that police personnel must respond quickly after receiving a police order. Any major threat to the personal and property safety of citizens, emergency call for help. In the city, they must arrive at the scene within 5 minutes. In the suburbs, they must arrive at the scene within 10 minutes. This was a hard indicator, so don't make a false police report. Otherwise, you will be invited to drink tea for a few hours. Seeing that the police came, Xianxia handed the little guy to Qin Ruoying, and he walked out with Xiao Yuan. The police car stopped in front of the tea house. The driver was a middle-aged policeman, and the policeman in the passenger seat was younger, about the same age as Wang Hao. At first glance, it was the standard of a civilian police and an auxiliary police. The middle-aged policeman was not polite. After glancing at Wang Hao and his group, he directly asked Xianxia, "Did you call the police?" Xianxia nodded. When he was about to explain the situation to the policeman, the middle-aged policeman pointed at Wang Hao and his group and asked, "Is it them?" Hearing this, Xiao Yuan suddenly acted like a class monitor reporting to the teacher. She quickly interrupted and said, "It's them. They just blocked the entrance of the tea house and caused trouble. They even smashed the window." "Did they do anything? Did they suffer any losses?" Xiao Yuan was stunned for a moment. After glancing at the untouched window, she said with some difficulty, "They didn't do anything. It seems that there are no losses. Okay, I got it." The middle-aged policeman nodded, then turned and walked directly across the street. This was a bar street, so there were often some drunk people causing trouble here. As a policeman in the area, he had seen too many, so he was not surprised by these situations. Who's the leader? As soon as the middle-aged policeman's voice fell, Wang Hao immediately replied with a smile. There's no leader. Just a few friends gathering here, chatting and looking at the scenery of Hohai. Don't give me that. Hurry up and leave. Do what you need to do. The middle-aged policeman glared at him and waved his hand to let them leave. Seeing this, Wang Hao said with some dissatisfaction, Hey, officer, we didn't break the law, right? This is not Zongnanhai. Are we not allowed to hang out here? That's right. Isn't this Bar Street? We still have to wait for the night to drink. One of the lackeys casually added. But when he spoke, his eyes were looking at Hohai, as if he didn't dare to look at the middle-aged policeman. The middle-aged policeman was also a veteran. He naturally knew how to deal with this group of punks, so he immediately said to Wang Hao, Take out your ID card. Wang Hao didn't seem to hear him clearly. The middle-aged policeman glanced at him, then suddenly saluted him. Then he took out his ID and said seriously, There have been many robberies around here. In order to ensure the safety of the people, I have the right to interrogate you. Please cooperate with the investigation. Otherwise, I have the right to forcibly summon you. If you have any objections, you can call 110 or 12,389 to complain. This is my police number. Please show me your ID card. Wang Hao was terrified when he saw that the middle-aged policeman seemed to have changed into a different person in an instant. Therefore, he quickly squeezed out a smile and saluted to the policeman. Then he said with a cheeky smile, Understood, right away, we'll leave right away. After that, he called his brothers and left. The middle-aged policeman saw that he was tactful, so he was satisfied and took back his ID. As a basic policeman, he was also considered to be a very responsible kind, so he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he was going to wait until Wang Hao and his group left. Under the gaze of the middle-aged policeman, Wang Hao had to reluctantly take his group to their car. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. So, before he left, he didn't forget to give Xianxia a middle finger, and then slowly made a gesture of slitting his neck. Looking at his posture, he seemed to be silently telling Xianxia that this matter wasn't over yet. The characteristics of hooligans, besides bullying the weak and fearing the strong, were also disgusting. If a business offended them, they wouldn't hurt them, but they would endlessly harass them, making it impossible for them to do business. Xiao Yuan also understood what Wang Hao wanted to express, so she quickly said to Xianxia, Boss, I'm sorry. I'll go and explain it to them. After that, she wanted to chase after Wang Hao and his group. This matter had to be resolved. Why not take advantage of the fact that the police were still here and have a good talk with Wang Hao? At most, she would just have to pay for it. However, Xiao Yuan had just taken 2 steps when Xianxia suddenly pulled her back, then shook his head at her, indicating that she shouldn't go. It had to be said that Xiao Yuan really thought of this matter too simply. Wang Hao was obviously coming for her. Although she didn't know what they wanted to do, it was obviously not for money. There must be another purpose. Seeing that Xiao Yuan was still confused, Xianxia sighed softly, Don't go. I think they're not doing it for money, but for you as a person, me as a person? What do you mean? Boss, I don't understand. However, Xianxia shook his head and didn't explain further. Seeing this, Xiao Yuan could only stand beside Xianxia obediently. The boss had just saved her, so he shouldn't be a bad person. Listening to him should be the right thing to do. Wang Hao and his group drove 4 cars. Chapter 143. This year was not a warm winter, but a cold winter. So in December, the water surface of Hohai had already condensed a thin layer of ice. Wang Hao's car was filled with 5 people. After the car drove into the water, the 5 people struggled to swim back to the shore. The other people on the shore hurriedly pulled them up. Looking at the people who were squeezing into the car, the middle-aged policeman couldn't help but sigh, karma. Although tourists accidentally fell into Hohai from time to time, the middle-aged policeman had been in this area for so long, and he really hadn't heard of anyone who could drive a car into Hohai. The car was probably scrapped, and how to get it out had become a big problem. It was estimated that the Shikahai subdistrict community would seek compensation from them. This group of stinky brats was also unlucky. But this was no longer the middle-aged policeman's business, so he called the young policeman and prepared to leave. "Comrade, take care." After Xianxia smiled and said hello to the middle-aged policeman, he took Xiao Yuan back to the tea house. As soon as they walked into the tea house, Qin Ruoying glanced at Xianxia with a smile. She knew what happened outside, so she guessed that this must be Xianxia's good deed. Young people don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. A little punishment is okay. After being disturbed by this group of bastards, the guests at the table who just left didn't even pay the bill. Now they didn't know where they went. After the couple cleaned up the teacups at their table, they returned to the bar with the little girl in their arms. Xiao Yuan stood in the lobby stupidly and looked at their calm appearance. For a while, she didn't know what to say. After a long time, Xiao Yuan came to the bar, bowed to the couple, and said sincerely, "Boss, lady boss, thank you." Hearing this, Qin Ruoying said with a smile, "Give you a piece of advice. Don't do this in the future. This is not a glorious career. With your education, you should be able to find a very good job in the future. I hope you can distinguish the priorities and don't ruin your future." After hearing her words, Xiao Yuan fell silent. After hesitating for a while, she nodded lightly and said in a low voice with a complicated expression, "I understand." "Thank you, lady boss." Qin Ruoying smiled and turned to look at Xianxia. Xianxia looked at his wife helplessly. Then he grabbed a black pill from the plate of sunflower seeds in front of the big cat. The big cat was lying lazily on the bar counter. When it saw that one of its snacks was taken away, it immediately stuck its head out and let out a dissatisfied meow. Xianxia stroked its head, then smiled at Xiao Yuan and said, "This is a pill left behind by an old Chinese doctor. I heard that it's especially helpful for kidney diseases. You can take this pill back to your father and see if it has any effect. Don't worry, it's a pure Chinese medicine formula. Even if it doesn't have any effect, there definitely won't be any side effects." Xiao Yuan took the pill skeptically. After glancing at it, she wrapped the pill in a tissue and said to Xianxia solemnly, "Thank you, boss. Go. Come, Nian, say goodbye to your sister." "Goodbye, sister." Hearing this, the little girl immediately stood on Xianxia's lap and stuck her head out from behind the bar counter. She smiled and waved goodbye to Xiao Yuan. "Goodbye, Nian. Sister will come to see you later." Xiao Yuan turned and left with a complicated expression. After leaving the tea house, she couldn't help but look back at the signboard with the words, "Qingyi Tea House," written on it. Then, as if she had finally made up her mind, she quickly walked towards the bar. The weather wasn't very good today. It was always gray. Although it wasn't hazy yet, there wasn't even a bit of sunlight in the cold weather. There was no way to cheer people up. After the little episode just now, it was already 4:30 in the afternoon. Perhaps she had been infected by the big cat. The little girl sat on Xianxia's lap and lazily put her chin on the bar counter. She constantly blew with her small mouth, trying to blow a tissue into the air. Xianxia wanted to take her out for a walk, but the little girl pouted and shook her head. It looked like she didn't want to move at all. The TV in the tea house didn't have a broadcasting function, so she couldn't order cartoons. Since she couldn't watch cartoons, she wanted to serve tea to the customers. There weren't many customers, so the little girl was bored to death. Qin Ruoying saw this and smiled gently. "Nian, mommy will tell you a story, okay?" Hearing this, the little girl's eyes suddenly lit up. Mommy's stories were better than daddy's stories. So she immediately climbed from Xianxia's lap to Qin Ruoying's lap. Then she shook Qin Ruoying's arm and smiled. "Mommy, tell me." "Okay, sit down first. Mommy will tell you a story." Once upon a time, there was a temple on the mountain. Qin Ruoying told the little girl the story of the 3 monks. But before the story was half finished, the door of the tea house was suddenly pushed open. Seeing this, Xianxia interrupted Qin Ruoying's story and said directly to the little girl, "Nian, look, there are guests." Guests? After a few days of getting used to it, the little girl had become familiar with the reception work of the tea house. So when she heard that there were guests, she was so excited that she wanted to jump out of Qin Ruoying's arms. Qin Ruing was afraid that she would jump and fall, so she had to put her down carefully. The little girl seemed to be very enthusiastic about greeting guests. So when she stepped on the ground, she ran out from behind the bar counter. However, when the little girl ran out of the bar counter and saw the guests, she couldn't help but be stunned. Immediately after, she ran back to the bar counter and hid.